York Times best-selling author, right? Fingerprints of the Gods. And then you're about to go on your season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse,
Ancient
right?
Apocalypse,
October 16th.
which launches on October 16th.
Yeah. So
and it's six episodes of 40 minutes each.
So I had Randall Carlson on. I've had Stephen Greer on multiple times, Billy Carlson on. And we have all these conversations, right? And, you know, you listen, and a part of the level of curiosity is kind of like, well, I don't know. They sound convincing. But I don't know. But I want to learn. I'm curious. I'm curious to know what they're going to be saying. So to me, you know, there's 3 different types of people when it comes down to the ancient civilization. There is the establishment side that maybe will say, look, there is no such thing as ancient civilization.
Indeed so. Or no such thing as a lost civilization.
A lost civilization, right. No lost civilization. That's the right word.
Yeah.
And then number 2 is, there was a lost civilization. Then there's a different camp that says, yes, there's a lost civilization, but they didn't have no advanced technology that you're talking about. And then there's the third camp that says there is the lost civilization and they had incredible advanced technology. Which of those 3 do you associate yourself more with? None of them.
No,
so
because the word advanced is extremely nuanced. What I'm talking about, and this is an area where my work has been repeatedly, deliberately, and in a calculated way misrepresented by archaeologists who don't like my work and the ideas that I'm suggesting. When I talk about an advanced civilization, let's be clear, I think that all civilizations on this planet emerged ultimately out of shamanism. If we go back into the Stone Age, if we go back into what's called the Upper Paleolithic, we will find that the world was pretty much shamanistic at that time. Every culture, every tribe, every group had its shaman who was bringing healing and who was dealing, if you like, with the supernatural. That's what shamans still do today in the Amazon rainforest. So I think that all cultures emerged out of a shamanistic background. But what I'm suggesting is that during the Ice Age, there was one culture which went quite a bit further than other cultures from that same shamanistic background. It's a characteristic of shamanism, which a lot of people don't realize, is that true shamans are extremely scientific. If you go to the Amazon rainforest, as I've done quite frequently, and as I do for season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse, and sit down to drink the powerful visionary brew, ayahuasca, you will discover that the shamans are constantly sampling plants. They're in an experimental, highly rigorous, rational way. They're sampling plants, they're adding admixtures to an existing brew, if that's the case. How else could they have created curare, for example? Curare is an Amazonian invention. Curare is still the basis of modern anesthesiology. It involves 11 different plants, none of which are effective on their own. You have to mix them all together. Same with ayahuasca, it involves 2 different plants, none of which are effective on their own, but mixed together they become effective. And when you remember that there's more than 100,000 different species of plants and trees in the Amazon, then you are looking at a scientific project to find, locate, and create these things. And this is true of shamanism in general. So I think that there was one shamanistic culture back during the Ice Age which went further than others. And when I say advanced, I want to be absolutely clear. I am not looking for us in the past. I am not talking about a civilization that had iPhones and flew to the moon, or built rocket ships, or Teslas, for example. A high-tech civilization. But I am
why? What is this?
That have gone much further than others during the Stone Age. And where it had gone, where I derive this from, is the evidence of a knowledge of longitude on ancient maps. Now, longitude are the vertical lines down the map, and latitude is the horizontal. Longitude is a problem that our civilization was unable to solve until the mid-18th century. It was always a risk being out at sea in a sailing ship, and you can't quite calculate the wind speed and the currency. If say you're sailing from Britain to America, you have no idea at any point exactly how far away you are from the American coast. And it's quite possible in the dead of night, if you've done your calculations wrong, that you're going to crash into that coast and hit it. It was a deadly, deadly problem. It was really important to know where you were at sea. It wasn't until the mid-18th century that Western civilization solved the longitude problem. And in fact, there was a huge prize being offered for anybody who could solve the longitude problem. Well, eventually they did by creating a chronometer which could keep accurate time at sea. But before that, nobody knew where they were in terms of longitude. It was always a rough guess.
What did they use back then? What did Columbus use when he went from Spain to Caribbean to here? Was it just a wing job?
Yeah, just rough guesswork. Just rough. And he, of course, didn't know. Columbus didn't even know for sure whether he was going to find a continent on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. But he had reason to believe he would, which touches on these ancient maps that I speak about. There was a sense that there was something there. But he wouldn't have known at any point in his voyage how far west of Greenwich in the UK he was. He wouldn't have had any idea. So knowing longitude was a real huge breakthrough for seafarers in our epoch, for our civilization. But these ancient maps that I'm speaking about, which are in many cases maps that were produced in the 14th, 13th, maybe 15th century, but always based on copies of older source maps now lost. The Orontius Phineas world map is an example. The Piri-Reis map is an example. And many of the maps that are called Portolanos that map the Mediterranean Sea are an example. They all contain extremely accurate relative longitudes. And they should not do so. Even if they were just made in the 14th century and not based on earlier source maps, they should have relative longitudes, but they do. So that's one reason why I'm pretty confident that the longitude problem was cracked much earlier, because some of these maps show the world as it looked during the last ice age. The Orontius Phineas map actually shows Antarctica as well. Yet our civilization didn't discover Antarctica until 1820, and there it is on a map from the 1500s.
I want to show you this, so maybe to the audience that doesn't follow this, if you can pull this up. I just pulled up the Piri-Reis.
Well, the Piri-Reis is only a bit of a map. That's all that's survived from the map, and it shows a bit of South America and a bit of Africa. The relative longitudes are good, but can we find the Orontius Phineas? Orontius Finaeus.
Orontius.
Yeah, and there we are. Well, what you're seeing on that map from the mid-1500s is at the very tip of South America and at the very tip of South Africa, you're seeing Antarctica. That's what that huge land, that's South America on the right, and that's the tip of South America, and it's touching an enormous continent, which is also at the south of South
Rob, can you show which one is South America that you're showing? So South America would be...
So keep going down, bottom right, keep going. That's South America.
Okay.
Go left, that's South Africa.
Okay.
Go right from there, that's Antarctica. And it even says the Antarctic Circle. That is Antarctica. And that's a problem, because our civilization did not discover Antarctica until 1820. We had no idea. And there are other maps. Could you find the Pinkerton world map from 1813, say, or roughly 1813? Let's see how it shows Antarctica. Pinkerton world map. No, that's not the bit of it. Keep going. Yes, the next one, the first one on the left there. That.
Bottom middle, right there.
Middle. Right.
We'll
No.
one more
Go
to
right,
the
one more.
right
That's
there.
it. There. That's how Antarctica is shown on a map.
Non-existent.
It isn't there.
Right.
And that's because it's an honest map.
That's 1818.
Yeah, 1818.
And you said that's because it's an honest map?
It's an honest map because at that time, navigators from our civilization hadn't found Antarctica. So they could only say, they couldn't map it because they hadn't seen it. Okay, that's the thing. That's why there's no Antarctica on this map. But a few years later, 1820, Antarctica is discovered, and it starts to appear on maps. But the anomaly is that it appears on these much earlier maps as well. Maps based on copies of even older source maps. And that suggests to me that somebody was mapping the world long before us. And furthermore, these maps often show the world amazingly, much as it looked during the last ice age. The world was very different during the ice age. Antarctica was much bigger during the ice age than it is today. For example, the Malaysian Peninsula and the Indonesian islands were all joined together into a single landmass that reached almost as far as New Guinea. New Guinea was joined to Australia. This was because sea level was 400 feet lower during the ice age than it is today. The world looked very different. And some of these ancient maps show the world as it looked during the last ice age.
Very interesting. And the fellow who discovered Antarctica was Nathaniel Palmer.
I believe so.
And do you know who he was and what he did?
No, because I'm fundamentally not interested in who discovered Antarctica in our era. What I am interested in is the fact that it was discovered in our era, around about 1820, and before that, there was no knowledge of Antarctica.
And so what's your point with this? Is it to go back and say the other map, which is the Pinkerton map, Pinkerton World Map, had Antarctica?
No, the Pinkerton World
Map
Map
is the honest map that didn't have it.
The Pinkerton World Map is an honest map based on the latest information that was available to navigators at that time. And it's not, Antarctica is not on that map because they hadn't found it yet.
And why does this matter?
Well, it matters because if Antarctica is present on ancient maps, then it means that somebody was able to sail the world, to explore the world's oceans, and to map the world's oceans, and furthermore to do so with rather good relative longitudes. That's what I mean when I talk about an advanced civilization, a civilization that had advanced astronomy, that was able to observe the stars, understand the rising and setting points of stars, navigate using stars, and that was able to explore and map the world. Therefore, it had some significant seafaring ability. But I'm not talking about a civilization that had motor cars or airplanes or iPhones.
I got you. So you've said, I think in the Ancient Apocalypse that you don't see yourself as an archaeologist, not a scientist, but as a journalist, right? Like as a researcher.
Definitely.
So as you research and go even deeper, is there any fingerprints of who was the first to find out about Antarctica at that time, especially if it's 1400, 1300, 1500?
Well, the only thing
name is mentioned?
No names are mentioned. It's just said to be there. There's on that Orontius Phineas map, there's a legend written in Latin at the bottom of it, and where the mapmaker boasts about revealing to the world areas that had been hidden in darkness before that. And that sounds to me like ancient maps that had been hidden away, and that some had been found. Hidden in darkness.
In traditional academia archaeologists, okay, and let's call them the establishment versus some of the guys that are challenged, like yourself. Okay, let's just
say me and Ronald Cost.
Sure, let's call it anti-establishment, the establishment, the traditional way of looking at it. Okay, and what is their position on this? What do they say? So these are the ones that have all the degrees and the fancy degrees and universities and professors and all these papers they've written. What do they teach students since they're
They don't take the ancient maps seriously. They think they were exercises in fantasy by ancient map makers. They don't believe that Antarctica was discovered until 1820. They think that some map makers just thought that there should be a landmass at the bottom of the Earth and just stuck it there imaginatively in exactly the place that Antarctica is. They dismiss the whole line of reasoning. But for me, I'm not claiming that these maps prove there was a lost civilization, but I am saying they are a huge anomaly and a puzzle, which I have plunged myself into. I'm following my curiosity wherever I go, and I'm doing so in a journalistic, not in an archaeological way. So what archaeologists study, much of it is very useful to me, and I have great respect for many archaeologists, and they do very detailed, nitty-gritty work down there in the dust, and it should be valued and it should be treasured. But I don't think it's the only way to investigate the past. I think we have to take other issues into account as well. So, for example, with the Great Sphinx of Giza, archaeologists will tell you that the Sphinx is the work of a particular pharaoh, Pharaoh Khafre, who they say built it during the 4th dynasty, around 2500 BC, give or take 50 years. There isn't a single contemporary inscription that says Khafre built the Sphinx. Nothing whatsoever. There is a stela that's in between the paws of the Sphinx, but that was erected more than 1,000 years later. And it doesn't even contain the name Khafre. It did once contain the single syllable Kaf, but the rest of the line is missing, and there's nothing on it which says Khafre built the Sphinx. That pharaoh who put that stela up some centuries later, could have been saying that Khafre restored the Sphinx. There's nothing contemporary that says Khafre was the maker of the Sphinx. And there are other stela on the Giza Plateau, which say that even Khufu, the predecessor of Khafre, knew the Sphinx. The Sphinx was already there in his time. So I think that the Egyptological case to attach the Sphinx to Khafre is extremely flimsy. The Sphinx is roughly in front of a second pyramid at Giza, which is attributed to Khafre. That's one of the reasons they connect it to him. And they think that the head of the Sphinx looks a bit like Khafre, although I kind of disagree with that. But that's not a central point. I and my colleagues, Robert Boval, John Anthony West sadly passed away, Professor Robert Schock from Boston University, Randall Carlson as well, are generally of the view that the Great Sphinx was originally a fully lion-bodied statue. And that it goes back more than 12,000 years, and I can explain to you why we think that. That it goes back more than 12,000 years, that the head sticking up there, the lion head, was badly damaged and eroded, and that in pharaonic times, perhaps indeed in the 4th dynasty, perhaps even during the reign of Khafre, they remodeled the head and put it into this head wearing a classic ancient Egyptian pharaoh's headdress, which is called the Nemes headdress. But what we think is that there was a lion there before that, and there's a very special reason for that.
Why is it?
Well, there's two reasons actually. The first reason is the orientation of the Sphinx. The gaze of the Sphinx targets directly the rising sun on a very special day of the year, and that's at dawn on the spring equinox. That's when night and day are of absolutely equal length. The Sphinx looks directly at the point where the sun rises, and you can confirm that today, and I have done, by going on the Giza Plateau before dawn, stand behind the Sphinx, and you can see that it is looking directly at the Sphinx. And in fact, the Sphinx is perfectly oriented due east, and your monument must be oriented due east if it's going to target the rising sun at dawn on the spring equinox. The sun does not always rise due east. In the summer solstice, it rises far to the north of east. In the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, it rises far to the south of east. But on the spring, it's like a pendulum along the horizon. On spring equinox, spot on, due east. Now the question is, in the ancient world, what was considered to govern the character of a world age was the constellation that lay behind the sun at dawn on the spring equinox. In our epoch, 2024, the epoch of 2024, and indeed going back right to the time of Christ, going back to AD 0.
Come on, man. Like,
sun
bro.
on the spring equinox
Like, come
was
on, man.
Pisces, and it remains
on.
Pisces to this day. It will quite soon, within 150 years or so, be Aquarius that's housing the sun in the spring equinox. We all know the word sun. We live in the dawn of the age of Aquarius. That's actually what it's all about. This effect of the constellation behind the sun, constantly shifting as though it's a kind of roundabout that's going round and round behind the sun, is caused by a wobble on the axis of the Earth. The Earth is our viewing platform from which we observe the stars. And that wobble causes the rising times of different stars and constellations to change in a very slow process. It's a complete cycle which unfolds over 25,920 years. And as a result of our observation platform being the Earth, and as a result of the Earth wobbling, we see the sun housed, that's the language that tends to be used, by a different constellation roughly every 2,160 years. So we've had Pisces for 2,000 years plus. We're going to have Aquarius. Before Pisces, it was Aries. At that time, the symbolism in ancient Egypt was all about rams. You know, if you just go to the temple of Karnak in Upper Egypt, you'll find that there's an avenue of ram-headed sphinxes which lead down into the temple of Karnak. Well, not those, no. It's the front entrance. Try it. You need to see the whole front of the temple. That one on the top. Yeah, these ones. These are ram-headed sphinxes. These are celebrating the age of Aries. That's when Aries housed the sun at that time, at the time that the Temple of Karnak was built. Go back further and you'll find that Egypt's all about bulls. Why? Because before the age of Aries, it was the age of Taurus. It was the constellation of Taurus that housed the sun. You have to go back 12,500 years ago, before our time, to find a very significant constellation housing the sun at dawn on the spring equinox. And that's the constellation of Leo. That's the constellation of Leo. And to cut a long story short, what I and my colleagues think is that the Sphinx was originally constructed as a terrestrial representation of the constellation of Leo, that it targeted the constellation of Leo when it rose behind the sun. That's the first reason. The second reason is the geology of the Sphinx. And here the work of Professor Robert Schoch at Boston University is fundamental, because he has demonstrated to the fury of Egyptologists and has received a great deal of extremely negative criticism from Egyptologists, but he's a highly credentialed geologist. And he's stuck his neck out, looking at the erosion patterns on the body of the Sphinx, and particularly because the Sphinx has been constantly restored, particularly on the trench out of which the Sphinx was cut. You can see these deep vertical fissures and a kind of scalloped, rounded profile, and that is classic rainfall-induced weathering. And in Schoch's view, the Sphinx at some point in its history was exposed to more than 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. And the bottom line is, such rains do not fall in the Giza Plateau today. They did not fall in the Giza Plateau 5,000 years ago, but they did fall in the Giza Plateau if you go back 12,000 years. That was the time when the Sahara Desert was green. That was the time when the world climate was completely different.
And this is what we're attributing for the creation of Plato's lost civilization planets over 11,500 years.
Yeah. By the way, don't necessarily believe everything you read on Wikipedia.
So
Wikipedia is an agenda-driven.
Even the founder says that. Yeah, I agree with that. Let me ask a different question. How many? I've seen you talk about the fact that you've climbed up the pyramid 5 times. I think you've said that, right?
Yeah.
And when you go there to the Sphinx of Giza, and you're there, right? The Great Sphinx of Giza. What do locals say when you talk to them? Is there a debate of what it is?
Well, the local name is Abu al-Hol, the father of terror, but nobody can really explain why. I've asked that question.
Is there any ideas, or do they have some kind of examples of?
No, nobody's ever given me
father of terror?
But that's how it's known. Yeah.
Have researchers given opinions why it's called the father of terror?
Not that I know of. No,
What
it's locally known. Anybody who lives in the village of Nazat al.
Father of terror in Arabic. The name is a reference to the legendary Sphinx that would terrorize people by making them answer a riddle.
Yeah.
The Sphinx is a world famous monument that sits in front. So, but what?
The people who live in Nazat al Saman, which is the village directly under the Sphinx.
Yeah.
They can't tell you why it's called that.
Yo, Drinky Vibes, how are ya?
What's their,
they're very proud of it.
In what way? Why are they proud?
Because it's a beautiful, magnificent thing. It's 270 feet long. It's 70 feet high. It towers over the Nile River. It looks out due east over the basin of the Nile. And fundamentally, because it is a worldwide.
What's up, Jersey Vibes? How are you?
Is very proud of. Nobody else has the Great Sphinx of Giza. Plenty of people have got pyramids, but nobody else has got the Great Sphinx. So there's a sense of pride. There's a sense of pride for the whole Giza Plateau, that it's something special that Egypt has, which other cultures don't have.
What's the story that they tell when they're having kids and their kids go to school? What story do they tell on what happened there?
When I've talked to Egyptians, local Egyptians living in Nazlat al Saman, they believe that the Sphinx is much older than the time of the dynastic Egyptians.
Really?
They believe that it's as old as time itself.
They believe it's as old as time itself. And why do they believe that?
Well, just look at it. That's why. Those erosion patterns around the side. There's a sense, a feeling of great antiquity about it. Of course, they're not looking up encyclopedias and going into the archaeological textbooks. They're just getting a gut reaction. It's amazing.
So when you talked about what it took to build a pyramid, right? The stats you gave, you said it's 6 million tons, 481 feet high.
Correct.
You can say probably better than that.
I'll say it exactly. The calculated weight is 6 million tons. The height is presently around 450 feet. But that's because the top 30 feet of the Great Pyramid came off in an earthquake around about the year 1300. So when you calculate the angle of slope, and it's 52 degrees angle of slope on each side, and project it further beyond the broken off top, you'll find that the original height of the Great Pyramid was 480 feet. Right now it's about 400.
How studied and researched is it? And what do we not, I guess the question would be, how studied and researched is it? The pyramid.
Well, I would say that this is amongst the most excavated and most studied archaeological sites in the entire world. So it's amazing that they're still finding new things there. For example, there's been using a high-tech scanning equipment, muon scanning, I believe. Just in the last 3 years, enormous cavities have been identified within the Great Pyramid, which nobody knew were there. There's a huge feature, famous feature within the Great Pyramid called the Grand Gallery. And it looks like there's another Grand Gallery above it, which has been identified by scanning, but nobody's got into it yet. Yeah, you can see it in some of those. No, that's the Grand Gallery. You can also see the scanning there.
Zoom in.
But you see, there's the Grand Gallery, and above it is the Scan Pyramid's big void. Well, nobody knew that was there until very, very recently, and it's not the only void that's in the Great Pyramid. So we're still finding out about new things about the Great Pyramid. Now, that void could be an architectural feature. It appears to slope at the same angle as the Grand Gallery. Or it might not be. It might just be, it's hard to understand why a sort of random vacant space would be left in this monument. But the fact is, all we know at the moment is that there's this huge cavity inside the pyramid that nobody has yet got into. And it isn't the only part of the pyramid. Out of the Queen's Chamber, so-called, when we call the chambers of the pyramids Queen's Chamber, King's Chamber, there's no basis for that. There's no evidence that any queen was ever buried in the Great Pyramid. Nor is there any evidence that any king, any pharaoh was ever buried in the Great Pyramid, because no pharaonic burial was ever found inside it. But there's the Queen's Chamber. And on the right-hand wall and on the left-hand wall, there are two little shafts cut into the wall. Actually, those shafts were invisible until, I believe it was 1872, when a curious British researcher went around tapping on the walls of the Queen's Chamber. He had a reason to do that, because the King's Chamber, I suspect that's a King's Chamber one. Yeah, the King's Chamber shafts were already known. There were shafts in the King's Chamber, and actually you could find their exit on the outside of the pyramid. You could roll a cannonball down them and they would end up in the King's Chamber. So, but there's no exit for the Queen's Chamber shaft. But he figured, look, if there's shafts in the King's Chamber, maybe there's shafts in the Queen's Chamber too. So he went around tapping on the walls, and sure enough, he found two hollow points. People didn't care about vandalism in those days. He got out a hammer and chisel and just hammered them through, and lo and behold, there's a horizontal passageway, and then it's leading up at an angle. It's about that high and that wide. Let's say 8 inches high and 8 inches wide. It's just very, very small. You can't get a human being in there. But back in the 90s, a special robot was designed, which was sent up there, sent up the southern shaft first. And what it found, after a journey of more than 160 feet, what it found was a door, a little stone door with two metal handles blocking the shaft. So the question is, what lies beyond that door? A new robot was designed with a drill on the front of it. They send the robot back up the shaft. They drill a hole in that door. What do they see when the camera goes through that hole? They see a cavity about 4 feet wide and another door at the end of that, closed, shut. And of course, they've not been able to drill through that one yet. So it's the same story on the other shaft as well. So what we're getting is evidence that the Great Pyramid still has many secrets to reveal. Years of study. In some ways, you could say thousands of years of study, and you can definitely say 150 years of detailed archaeological study, have still not got to the bottom of the mysteries of the Great Pyramid. They've not solved how it was built. There are many theories as to how it was built.
But this is roughly 2,000, 2,500 BC, right? Something like that.
Yeah, that's the establishment date for the construction of the Great Pyramid. I don't have a big problem with that date. I think in the Great Pyramid we're looking at a multi-generational project. I completely reject the notion that the Great Pyramid was a tomb and only a tomb, which is what Egyptologists say. And I reject the notion that this massive, incredibly precise monument, because it is almost perfectly aligned to true north, south, east and west, that it could have been built in the 23 years of Khufu's reign. I mean, you don't start building your own tomb until you're actually on the throne. So he was on the throne for 23 years, and that's what Egyptologists say, the pyramid was built in 23 years. I can't accept that. Nobody who's got a background in engineering and construction who I've talked to can accept that either. This thing couldn't be built in 23 years unless there was some kind of extraordinary technology that the ancient Egyptians possessed, which we don't yet know that they possessed. It looks much more likely that it was built up over a long period of time, but that undoubtedly the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty finished it off and put the casing stones that were once on the outside of the Great Pyramid. But I'm of the opinion, and again this is just my view based on my own research and my own work, is that what stood at the Giza Plateau 12,500 years ago was the Sphinx in the form of a lion. Were some megalithic temples. There's a huge megalithic temple called the Valley Temple right next door to the Great Sphinx. Again, there's nothing that connects it in writing that connects it to any particular epoch, but it has blocks of stone that weigh 100 tons each. Those are also heavily weathered, just as the Sphinx is. So my suggestion is that on the Giza Plateau you have a number of megalithic temples which still stand. You have the Great Sphinx, and you had ground platforms, not very high, where the 3 pyramids were built, laid out in a very specific, very precise angle to one another. And that precise angle matches the angle of the, yes, this is the Valley Temple, and what we're looking at there is exactly an interesting point, because you're looking at granite blocks that were put there in Old Kingdom times that face limestone blocks. And it's those limestone blocks that are behind those granite blocks. You can see them if you look right to the back. You can see the limestone blocks that haven't been covered with facing stones. So just as we believe that the Sphinx was restored by the pharaohs, we also, I and my colleagues, are also of the opinion that the Bali Temple was restored by the pharaohs. But what they found was a much, much, much older monument, which they treasured and valued and venerated.
You've climbed all the way to the top 5 times, you said, right?
I have.
Now, let me ask you, when you climb all the way, are you tied to anything, or is it open like it's, Rob, can you, because I just found a video of somebody climbing all the way to the top, and this is, can you play this clip, Rob, the one I just sent you? So this is a fellow, I don't know who this is.
Yeah.
They posted this video. Is this literally what it looks like when you climb to the top?
You bet. It's exactly what it looks like. It's mountaineering to a certain extent.
I mean, if you fall, you're falling.
If you're more than 20 feet up and you fall, you're pretty much certain to be dead. If you're 200 feet up, you definitely will be dead. And people die every year.
Come on, man.
How
Like,
do you,
just
how do
like
you
fuck
come
off.
down carefully? Because this is essentially 45 stories high.
Yeah, that's right. You come down very carefully. I was actually on one of the climbs that I and my wife Santa did. I was ahead, and I reached up to
Pause, right?
some of the blocks. Some of the blocks are only this high. Some of them are almost 6 feet high, and you have to pull yourself up onto them. The courses vary in height from course to course, and I was levering myself. I got hold of the top of the block, and I was pulling myself up onto that so that I could get my knees onto it and get on the top. When the limestone that I was holding, which was very eroded, broke off in my hands, I fell back. Fortunately, my wife was right behind me, and she pushed me very, very hard and stopped me falling. But that could have been the end of me.
I just searched right
Which
now.
many Egyptologists would wish it perhaps had been.
I'm sure they would. But I just searched the following, Rob. How many people died climbing the Great Pyramid? Okay. And the number shows 1,600, over 1,600 people have died climbing the pyramid in the last 200 years. I can see that, because if you fall 1, 2, 3, 4, you're not going to be able to stop yourself right there. I mean, that's pretty.
The slope is 52 degrees. It's a steep slope, and once you start rolling, you're gone. There's no way. And that's why people get killed.
What do you feel like when you're all the way at the top? Is there an
fuck,
energy
man?
you feel? Is there when you're looking around? What are you thinking? What are you feeling when you're all the way at the top?
It's a magnificent, majestic place to be. There's first of all a sense of relief. I got to the top.
How long did it take on average?
For me, about 25 to 30 minutes to do the climb. There was a gentleman, in fact, the gentleman who helped me with my first climb of the Great Pyramid, who's now passed away. He was known locally as Champion, because back in the 1930s and 40s, people used to run races up the Great Pyramid. And he was able to run up the Great Pyramid and do the climb in 11 minutes. Well, I'm not as fit as he was, so in my case, about 25 minutes down.
It's still good though.
Yeah.
25.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah. So, okay, play the other clip, Rob. The other one that shows the inside of it, and this is just kind of giving a glimpse. This is apparently what Harvard put together. Can you get out to kind of
Well, that's a good place to be, actually. That's a good place to be because that's Mamun. That's called Mamun's Hole.
Thanks to Harvard University, you can virtually now enter that pyramid. Okay, can you show that, Rob? Go back and play the clip, and maybe you can narrate this for us while we're looking at it.
Sure.
Go ahead, Rob.
Okay, go back to the beginning. I need to explain to you what we're actually looking at here. Can I do that?
Yeah, please go for it. Yes.
What we're looking at here is the result of an Arab.
That's 4 in a row, 4 side steps in a row. That's pretty
under
jokes.
a caliph called Caliph al-Mamun, who was very curious about antiquities, and he was already aware of other pyramids in Egypt in which the entrance was in the north face. As a matter of fact, the entrance to all Egyptian pyramids is in the north face. But at that time, the true entrance of the Great Pyramid was not visible because all of the sides were sheerly covered sheer with beautiful polished limestone facing stones, some of which individually could weigh as much as 16 tons. They were completely covered and closed the pyramid, and nobody knew where the entrance was. It seems that in ancient times there was a way to open that doorway, to open those facing stones and to get in. But nobody knew in the 9th century where it was. So Caliph al-Mamun got together a gang of workers with sledgehammers and chisels, and he went up onto the north face of the Great Pyramid, roughly where he thought the door might be, and he started breaking his way in. And what we're looking at here is a man-made tunnel physically forced into the Great Pyramid and generally known as Mamun's Hole.
Have you walked through this?
You bet. I've walked through it more times than I can count. And that now is the entrance through which tourists enter the Great Pyramid.
What floor is this on? Is this?
Oh, it's about 25
It's a lake
feet up,
class
maybe
anyway.
45 feet, maybe 30 feet up. But the true entrance, of course, has now been found. And it's a little bit above Mamun's Hole. And you can see that there are slabs of stone in a kind of that sort of shape, like an A figure, which block it. If you search for true entrance to the Great Pyramid, you can see it as well. There it's a little bit above Mamun's Hole, but nobody who goes to the Great Pyramid today goes in through that true entrance. They all go in through Mamun's Hole.
Is this what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's
okay.
right. That's actually the real entrance to the Great Pyramid.
And are you actually able to go in through it?
No, because at a certain point, this is another of the curiosities, is that the internal passageway system of the Great Pyramid was deliberately blocked with gigantic granite blocking stones. So when the Mamun and his team broke in, they didn't know exactly where they were going, but as they got deeper into that cavern that you were showing us, as they got deeper into that, hammering away, they suddenly heard something very large falling in a nearby space. There was a space nearby where something huge fell. And that struck them as interesting. They knew where the sound came from. They started heading for that. And they found themselves in what is called the ascending corridor of the Great Pyramid. And underneath them, behind where they cut in, were these huge granite not facing stones, huge granite blocking stones, which blocked that passageway. But they had gone round them and found themselves in the passageway system. And from there, it was clear running. They could go up the ascending corridor, they could enter the Queen's Chamber, they could then continue on up the Grand Gallery, and they could come to the King's Chamber. That was the situation once they'd broken in and found the original system.
So what did they? So this right here, Rob. Just if you don't mind watching it one time all the way through, just to kind of get a feel.
Yeah.
Rob, if you can just play this, go for it.
What you're walking through is a man-made tunnel broken in by force.
Put it at regular speed, Rob. Go ahead.
It's a tunnel that was broken into by force, roughly hacked out of the body of the Great Pyramid, which fortunately accidentally led to this, which is the ascending corridor.
So this is not built. Man opened this up.
Yes. There's okay. The complications of the Great Pyramid are beyond belief. There's an ascending corridor, but there's also a descending corridor.
Were these stairs there, or did somebody build them?
No, those stairs have been put in modern
times.
Okay, they did not exist. Let's keep on going down. Let's keep on going down.
So we're going down now.
Let's go down. Let's go down. The descending corridor. No, we're in the Queen's Chamber. No, we're not quite going the right way at the moment. We're going up. But there's two ways. You can go up or you can go down. And we did see the down view. There, this is it. Then you come into the so-called subterranean chamber, cut out of bedrock 100 feet beneath the base of the Great Pyramid. When you come up that, you then join the junction of that and the Grand Gallery, and you can then continue all the way up to the top.
How high does this route go? Like, are you going up a lot or not a lot?
You're going up hundreds of feet at a slope of 26 degrees. And by the way, that's worth making a point of too, because the external slope of the Great
Yeah, I
Pyramid
don't
is
think I'm ever
50
gonna go in the
degrees,
pyramid.
And every corridor, every
I think I've decided for sure.
There's
There's no way I'm going to enter ever
So we
the
know that
pyramid.
geometers and mathematicians where it work.
Pretty
It's
terrifying.
not an easy. Once you get to the Grand Gallery, it's fine because that's almost 30 feet high. But when you're going up the ascending corridor or going down the ascending corridor, you're in a passageway, I should call it. You're in a passage that is about 3 feet 5 inches in height. Now that means that you're going to have to bend over double, pretty much, to go down it. And what I've learned from years of exploration of the Great Pyramid is that if you're going down one of those passageways, it's better to go down backwards because then you don't keep smashing your head on the top of it. If you go down forwards, you're going to bump your head 5 times by the time you get to the bottom. But if you go down backwards, that doesn't happen. Anyway, it's very difficult to, particularly for anybody who's unwell, to actually go up there.
Graham, when somebody, an archaeologist, rather, if you can pull out what I just sent you, this is when you go to Egypt, this is their tours portal. But when an archaeologist or scientist...
Yeah, by the way, in the middle there, 1, 2, 3rd from left, in the middle, the rank below, that one there, that's a newly found passageway as a result of which was identified by this scanning, and it has been opened up. It's above the entrance to the Great Pyramid.
Well, what I'm asking is, if an archaeologist or a scientist wants to go in there, investigate with a team of 50, okay, just to find out what's going on there, is there regulation? Is there approval? Do you need permits? Like, what's the process to go in there and investigate in?
We are dealing with the last surviving wonder of the ancient world. The Egyptian authorities do protect it well.
In what way?
Well, first of all, it's heavily guarded. And if you don't have permits, you're not going to get into it. Of course, there's a tourist traffic, but they have to get their tickets at the entrance and come in with a guide usually. And
Heavily guarded.
yes, the Great Pyramid is guarded, and indeed rightly so, as quite a number of ancient monuments are.
So if somebody with a strong...
You can't just roll up there and start working.
Have you ever gotten an approval to go out there and investigate the pyramid with a team or not?
No, I have had approval a couple of times to climb it. The other climbs that I've done were unapproved.
Unapproved? Mm-hmm. Middle of the night or throughout the...
First climb that my wife Santa and I did was in 1993, and we started the climb at 4 o'clock in the morning.
You started climbing at 4 o'clock in the morning? Good for you.
We started at 4 o'clock in the morning.
I would never join you. I just want you to know. I would say, tell me how it is at the end.
I was only 43 years old then, and I was pretty fit.
It's not about the fit part. Middle of the night, you want me to climb up 450 feet that I'm not going to see nothing. Is there a light like you see when he climbed up? Was it majestic?
Yeah, majestic starlight.
So this means if the Egyptian authority sees it, you're going to get arrested next time we go there. I just want you to know that.
Absolutely.
Okay. But no, going back to it. Is there a fight for scientists and archaeologists? Is this like, I climbed, Mount Everest. I did this, and I investigated this, and I went to the Amazon. Is this one of those things where if you're allowed to go in and you do get an approval, what are those approvals typical like? Are they restrictions? You can't go touch this. You have to have somebody that walks with you. What are those guidelines look like?
For example, Mark Lehner of the University of Chicago is a Western archaeologist who's been specialized on the Giza Plateau for many, many years. And I could say with confidence that Mark would have access to pretty much any point on the Giza Plateau where he wants to go. But still, there are limits. I know that there have been a couple of drilling projects around the Great Sphinx, ostensibly to clear out rainwater or groundwater from under the Sphinx. Not quite sure why those drilling projects happened. But it's very difficult to ground truth what the scanning has revealed, which is a large, regular chamber beneath the left forepaw of the Sphinx. If you go down about 15 or 20 feet, none of the drilling has gone to that point, as far as we know. So there are limits on what can be done. Nobody wants to see the Sphinx destroyed. Drilling around the Sphinx could cause destruction. And while we have excellent remote scanning facilities available, there's perhaps not a reason to do so. I would like to see it done, but I'd like to see it done with great care, because the Sphinx is regarded in many traditions, including in ancient Egypt itself, as a place where an archive of records was preserved from the past. But not everybody can just go there and work, and even those who are very experienced and spent their lives working on the Giza Plateau are going to need to go through a series of hoops in order to do any archaeology. Nonetheless,
is it political? Is it pretty political to get up there, or
no,
it's not political?
I don't think it's political. It's about preserving the monuments and making sure
Moot.
that people who are there have some
God
sort of,
damn it.
who are doing archaeological work at any rate, have some serious purpose.
Egyptian archaeologists have a advantage over others because they're local, that they want to find out too.
Yes, Dr. Zahi Hawass is the leading Egyptian archaeologist, Egyptologist. He's world famous. He's devoted his entire life to the study of the Giza Plateau. I would say that Zahi has access to everything that he chooses to have access to. He's a very experienced man.
What percentage of it has been explored? You know how they say less than 5%?
Typically, on archaeological sites, that's the case. It's less than 5%. In the case of the Giza Plateau, very close to the Great Pyramids, I'd say it's significantly more than that. But there's a lot that has not been explored.
Could there be things in there that, if we explore, it could help advance, society or civilization in ways that can help us reveal a bunch of secrets about life and what to do and what not to do? Do you think there's anything there, or?
Well, that would be a speculation, but it would be a reasonably fair one. If you take my point of view, which is that we are a species with amnesia, that we have forgotten an incredibly significant part of our own story that unfolded during the Ice Age. We've forgotten it. And that there were certain places on Earth, and the Great Sphinx is one of them, and Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is another, where survivors of a destroyed civilization made their way, took refuge amongst local people, and passed on knowledge, while at the same time receiving knowledge from those local people, and perhaps established these places as an archive, as a time capsule for future civilizations to decode. And that's not an entirely unreasonable point. The Great Pyramid itself is an archive of knowledge and information. You don't need to actually find papyri writing on it. The Great Pyramid can speak to you with its very precise orientation to true north, south, east and west, with its shafts which turn out to point at very specific stars in specific periods, and with its layout on the ground in connection to the other two pyramids, which matches the three stars of Orion's belt, not as they looked in 2500 BC, but as they looked in 10,500 BC. Again, there's this wobble on the axis of the Earth known as precession, which changes the orientation on the rising
What? Come on, man.
And in the case of a constellation of Orion, over the cycle of 26,000 years, you see it go up and down vertically on the horizon, on the meridian, the north-south line that divides the sky. And the time you get the perfect match of the three great pyramids on the ground with the three stars of Orion's belt isn't when the pyramids are supposed to have been built. It's thousands of years earlier. It's 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago. And that's the same time that the Sphinx locks to the constellation of Leo. So I and my colleagues are of the opinion that this cannot all be coincidental. That this place is using the language of astronomy and powerful megalithic architecture, which is going to be very difficult to destroy, to pass down information to the future.
What the
That's
fuck,
why
man?
it's intriguing that when you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. When you measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by the same number, 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. Egyptologists know this. They know that it's a case. They regard it as completely coincidental. And even my opponent in the debate I did earlier this year on the JRE, Flint Dibble, accepts that the ratio is correct, but he doesn't see any significance in the ratio. He just thinks it's an accident. But that number 43,000...
He's got a nice hat on. You've got to give him credit for that.
You've got to give him credit for that. It's a good hat. And he's a very smart guy. Flint is a very clever man. He knows his stuff. But the point is that that number is not a random number. Let me explain why. There's two things that aren't random. First of all, the Great Pyramid is clearly a monument that is speaking to the Earth. The Great Pyramid is oriented perfectly to the cardinal directions of the Earth, north, south, east, and west. It is a monument that is keyed in to the Earth in its cardinal directions. And secondly,
What the fuck is
I
this
mentioned to you
bullshit?
this phenomenon called precession, which changes the rising points of the stars as the years go by over a cycle of 25,920 years. The rate of change is 1 degree every 72 years. That's a tiny little thing on the horizon. That's the width of your finger held up against the horizon. 1 degree every 72 years. 43,200 is a multiple of 72. It is 600 times 72. You will find that that number is a sacred number in cultures all around the world. Multiples of that number,
Oh.
for example,
Come on.
432,000. That's the number of syllables in the Rig Veda. 72. Those are the conspirators who worked to kill the god Osiris at some time in the distant past. You find these numbers occurring in mythology all around the world, and you find them occurring in architecture all around the world. So if the ratio of the Great Pyramid to the Earth was 1 to 60,000, I wouldn't make much of it. But here we have a monument that is locked in to the cardinal directions of the Earth, and then gives you the dimensions of the Earth on a scale defined by a key motion of the Earth itself, that wobble of the axis of the Earth. To me, this is sophistication. This is not coincidence.
Yeah, I mean, it's, math, 72 times 600, 43,200 by syllables, 42.
432,000 syllables in the Rig Veda.
Yeah, that's
so many
pretty
other
wild. I mean, okay, so let's go to this. Basic stuff that innocent people this is not what they study on a daily basis. How were the pyramids built? If you go a little bit lower, this is an article when you go visit Egypt and you're touring, this is what they tell you. So here's how the pyramids were built. Go a little lower, Rob. They have different methods, so theories about how it was built. Go lower, Rob. So first one is called the ramp theory, then the water shaft. Right? When you look at the water elevators, I got pictures if you go lower, Rob, and I want to ask you, because this is his world.
These are all suggestions. These are all
suggestions and
nobody
theories.
knows how it was built.
Right. If you go a little bit lower, go lower, and then you have this is one way where they were bringing it up. Okay, keep going. So when you look like that's another way. I mean, similar to the other one with the block placements
a
of the
spiral
pyramid.
ramp effectively that winds around the pyramid.
What is your theory of how it was built?
My theory is that ramps don't do it. If you have a straight ramp, which is leading up to the Great Pyramid, if it's going to carry blocks right up to it will be the top of the Great Pyramid. You're looking. No gang of workers can haul a 20-ton block up a slope.
Like, stop shooting me.
So you're looking at a ramp which is going to extend roughly a mile out into the desert. Furthermore, that ramp is going to have to bear the load of very heavy megaliths to be carried up. Therefore, the ramp itself has got to be extremely strong in order to carry that load. And the problem is, where's the ramp? Where's the remains? There's nothing there on the Giza Plateau to suggest that. And so that's why this idea of spiral ramps has been proposed. Various other suggestions have been made. But the truth is, as everybody will admit, is that these are all theories and that nobody knows how the Great Pyramid is done. I get it. There is no doubt that large numbers of strong men can haul very large blocks of stone on the level. They can if they're on a horizontal surface. There are even images from ancient Egypt with hieroglyphs which show a kind of sled-like device with a very large statue on it. We might guess its weight at 50 tons. Being hauled along by teams of workers, and on the front of the sledge an individual is standing there pouring water in front of the runners of the sled to make the sand slippery underneath it. And that would work. That would absolutely work horizontally. But the problem then becomes how you get those gigantic blocks much higher up in the pyramid. And I don't think the ramp theory works at all. And you have, for example, in the so-called King's Chamber, it is roofed by a series of granite blocks, and those granite blocks don't come from Giza, by the way. They were brought from 500 kilometers to the south. It's roofed by a series of granite blocks And those granite blocks weigh about 70 tons each. And then there are other chambers above the King's Chamber, which most people don't get into. I've been into them. There's 5 chambers. They're called the relieving chambers, and each one of them is also floored and roofed by 70-ton granite blocks. And to get that massive collection of 70-ton blocks, about 300 feet into the air, to put them where they are now, is not going to be done with wet sand, and it's not going to be done with sledges. And to do it with ramps, I think, is extremely unlikely.
Relieving chambers?
Yeah.
You said there's 5 of them?
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4. The top one is 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5. And the first one there, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There's 5 chambers there. I've been in all of them. The one at the very top, under that gabled roof, that is one of the reasons why. Am I close enough to the microphone? I'm not sure.
No, we hear you.
That's one of the reasons why Egyptologists feel confident in saying that it was the work of Khufu, because in that top chamber there is what is known as a royal cartouche. Each pharaoh, the name of each pharaoh was surrounded by a kind of oval device called a cartouche, and in that cartouche is roughly written the name Khufu. This is considered to be a quarry mark that was put on the block at the time the block was quarried and was never cleared away. You're looking at a cartouche on the left there, but that's not from Khufu's. Well, that is actually Khufu's cartouche, I think. But what you want to see is the one in the relieving chamber, because that is the single piece of writing that Egyptologists rely on to attribute the whole of the Great Pyramid to Khufu. There's a whole other argument. How was that first discovered in the modern era? It was discovered by a British explorer called Howard Vyse. And Howard Vyse in the mid-1800s was a vandal of the worst kind. He blew a massive vertical hole in the southern side of the Great Pyramid. Just scarred it, tore it to pieces with dynamite. And he dynamited his way into those relieving chambers as well. Now, Howard Vyse was suffering from real serious financial difficulties. He'd not made a significant discovery. He was £10,000 in debt, which was a really bad thing to be in the 1800s. And he had to come up with an amazing discovery. So there have been suggestions, which Egyptologists do not accept. There have been suggestions that Howard Vyse actually forged that cartouche, and he put it there in order to...
Just to come out and say, here's what I found.
Here's what I found.
Hey, this is why it's worth funding my next project.
Exactly, and it made his career.
How much fraud is there in archaeologists where they have to make up something for them to get credibility in their writing so they can sell more and get another raise or ask for more money when they're giving lectures and all this other stuff? How much, you know how they say there's 70% of art is fraud? How much fraud is there in archaeologists?
I would like to say not too much. I would like to say that. There is, of course, some fraud in archaeology. Human beings are human beings, and it can happen. But archaeology is a profession that polices itself pretty well. If a fraudulent claim is made, it is going to be exposed pretty soon. And I think particularly around world-famous monuments like the Giza monuments, I would be very surprised to see much of fraud. Of course, any
just pulled up an article. Check this out.
Yeah, there it is.
Crazy.
Yeah, that's it. That's the cartouche in the relieving chamber, and that is the sole piece of written evidence which Egyptologists rely on to attribute the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, to Khufu. This is one of the ways in which the Giza pyramids are different from later pyramids. Giza pyramids are all attributed to the 4th dynasty. Go to the next dynasty, the 5th dynasty, and you're going to find pyramids like, classic example is the pyramid of Unas at Saqqara. That's U-N-A-S. The interior of the pyramid of Unas is completely covered
What?
with hieroglyphic
Why? Fuck this stupid
naming the
fucking
pharaoh
name.
Unas. There's a massive amount of inscriptions. But the exterior of the pyramid of Unas, as you can see there, is a mess. Now, you would have thought if the Great Pyramid was built 50 or 100 years before this, that they'd carry on improving. You wouldn't have thought they'd devolve, build something like the Great Pyramid, and then 50 years later build, or 100 years later build this mess.
So what happened?
Well, it seems like the ability to build pyramids was confined to a very specific period. And when they'd stopped it, they carried on building pyramids, but they weren't building them to the same standard, but they were doing something different. They were placing inscriptions inside them in detail, which do not exist in any of the Old Kingdom pyramids.
This is kind of like we were better at landing on the moon 60 years ago than today.
Kind of like that.
Yeah,
but it's interesting because you normally do see a continual evolution, but in this case, you definitely see a devolution.
Which, in a sense, it doesn't make sense. When I say make sense, it doesn't make sense. Okay, so let me ask you this. Let's say Graham Hancock is given a unlimited budget and you're hired as the lead guy to go. I just looked up right now, only 10%, less than 10% of findings we've explored of the pyramid. That's what I just saw. If you were given an unlimited budget, open checkbook, a team that you get to put together, and ample time to go investigate everything you can about the pyramid, what would you do?
Well, the first and most important thing would be ensure that whatever investigation took place did not damage or destroy anything of great importance. This is something that's not often realized about excavations. When you excavate a site, you effectively destroy that site. So it had to be a very careful project with people who were very committed and in fact loving towards the Great Pyramid.
Come on, man.
But were it to be possible, were such a team to be assembled, who we could be sure would not cause unnecessary massive damage inside the Great Pyramid, then my first priority would be to investigate what is in those voids that are all being found around within the Great Pyramid. Are there other chambers in there? And if so, which have never been accessed ever by anybody since the pyramid was completed, I would like to know what's in there. That would be my goal. And I hope perhaps we will see that happen in the next 20 years.
Do you think there's anything revolutionary there? It's just kind of like we're just learning more about history.
Well, I suspect there might be, because it's clearly great lengths were gone to make these places very hard to access. Just like the shaft of the Queen's Chamber that I told you about, which goes, it's like an invitation. It's please investigate me, please explore me, please find out about me. But we are going to set you a series of hurdles that's going to make it very difficult to do that. You've got to earn the right to investigate me. And now that we have this scanning technology, we're getting to the point, at least in terms of our science, where we've earned the right, where we have the ability to ask the pyramid questions and to get answers from it.
Last time Randall Carlson was here, we went and we talked about all this stuff, and he was like, Pat, we haven't even talked about ancient civilization, Atlantis. I'm like, oh my God. I said, we're out of time. We went for a couple hours. I really enjoyed talking to him. I said, next one we got to do something where we get into it. I think when we talk to you guys, an hour and a half is not enough. You need 3-4 hours when we talk to you, right? But going into lost, ancient civilizations that are, many different words we can use with them. We hear Atlantis. I've heard you talk about India, Japan, a couple other places. Where are we at now? Are we at a place that the establishment and the anti-establishment is united on the fact that, yes, these places exist?
No, really? Not at all. The establishment archaeology regards Atlantis as a joke and doesn't take it seriously at all. The view of establishment archaeology is that Atlantis was a fiction made up by the Greek philosopher Plato. The earliest surviving reference in writing that we have to Atlantis, in writing that we can read, is the work of Plato. And it's in the dialogues known as the Timaeus and the Critias. And he speaks about this great civilization based upon an island, which was at one time nurturing, kind, gentle, loving, but as gradually became delirious with power and began to impose its power upon other peoples around the world. And eventually the universe struck it down with this enormous flood, and Atlantis was submerged beneath the sea. Now, Egyptologists reject all of this. There is also a mention of Athens in the Atlantis story as it's passed down to us by Plato, and archaeologists in general rightly point out that there was no Athens at that time. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself because the time is important as well. Unlike many ancient myths, Plato's story of Atlantis actually contains a date, very specific date. Here's the provenance of that story. A famous Greek lawmaker called Solon traveled to Egypt around 600 BC. And Solon did a kind of tour of Egypt with a translator. And on that tour, he stopped off at a temple in the Delta dedicated to the goddess Neith, the temple of Sais in the Delta. And there he saw enormous inscriptions on the walls, and he asked local priests to translate those inscriptions for him. And those inscriptions told the story of Atlantis. Atlantis is not an ancient Egyptian word. We're looking at a word that made its way from ancient Egyptian into Greek. We're getting a Greek word with Atlantis, not an Egyptian word. But that word was the result of a translation done in 600 BC by a priest for Solon. And that translation told the story of Atlantis. Okay?
Come on, man. Come on.
Plato inherits that story, and he embeds it into the dialogues of Timaeus and Critias. So, here's the point. The priest that gave the translation to Solon asked him, when did this happen? When was Atlantis swallowed up by the sea? And the priest replied, quite matter-of-factly, 9,000 years ago. That's where we need to do the math. Solon was there in 600 BC. So we're now talking about 9,600 BC, which is 11,600 years ago, give or take 20 years. And that turns out to coincide exactly with what is called meltwater pulse 1b. There was an enormous rise in sea level at that exact time, around 11,600 years ago. So if Plato just made up the date that was given to Solon, it's extraordinary that it coincides with the latest geological evidence on meltwater pulse 1b, when islands could have been swallowed.
Come on, man.
This is the...
But Graham, how hard could it be to... I mean, if you look at the patterns on the way it would be in the middle of the ocean, whatever the location would be, how hard is it for archaeologists to say, yeah, that makes sense. Something could have been here.
Well,
what is their argument to say that?
It's very hard for them to say it because it means admitting that there was a lost civilization, which is something that archaeologists don't want to do. However, they say that the reason they think it's a fantasy is because Athens is mentioned in it, and there was no Athens then, and because it appears to be trying to teach moral lessons. That it's a sort of moral lesson about how a society can become overconfident and overproud and be brought down. I get it. I get that. But what they don't do, and what they should do, and I've never seen this done in any critique of Atlantis, is they do not understand. They certainly do understand, but they do not inform others that there are roughly 200 myths from all around the world that speak of a global flood, of a global cataclysm that submerged and destroyed a prior civilization. And I think the Atlantis story has to be seen in context of those global flood myths. So certainly I believe that Plato drew the idea from an ancient Egyptian original, but he then used that idea to make political points as well. But the idea itself isn't a unique or rare idea. It's found in hundreds of flood myths all around the world, and Atlantis is one of those flood myths. So I'm actually very sure that Atlantis is a genuine story. Exactly where or what Atlantis was is something that requires further work. But one important development is that there is one temple in Egypt that's left standing which still contains the Atlantis account. The temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta no longer exists, but the temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt has inscribed on its walls what are called the Edfu building texts. And when I first started working with those texts, I was working with translations that were done in the 1960s. And they were partial translations, but they talk briefly about a primeval homeland of the gods, which was an island, which was struck by something like a serpent that came down out of the sky and split the island, and then the island was swallowed up by the sea. There were survivors. They headed off in all directions, and some of them came to Egypt. And there in Egypt, they built what are called primeval mounds. And those primeval mounds were to be the basis, the foundation of all future temples and pyramids that would be built in Egypt. The problem with the Edfu building texts is the temple of Edfu is a Ptolemaic temple. It dates to about 280 BC, and that is after Plato. That's after Solon. But there's two things clear, that we're looking at a body of information that was preserved on the walls of a number of temples, of which the last surviving is the temple of Horus at Edfu. And secondly, those words, the language that is used in the hieroglyphs of the Temple of Horus at Edfu is not the language of 280 BC. It's not Ptolemaic Egyptian. It's Middle Kingdom Egyptian. It's language that's 2000 BC. And states quite clearly that what they were doing was making permanent, by carving them into the walls, material that was in the ancient archives of the prior temple that had stood on Edfu. It turns out that the latest version of the Temple of Edfu is indeed only the latest version, that it stands on the foundations of an older temple, which stood on the foundations of an older temple, etc., etc. The archives were preserved, and in Ptolemaic times they were permanently put on the walls of the temple. The Middle Egyptian is important, the antiquity of the language in which these are inscribed in Ptolemaic times, and the fact that there is a reference to 7,000 years ago, this great flood. And when you add 7 to 2000 BC, you get to 9,000, very close to the date that was given to Solomon. So I think that Egyptologists and archaeologists should be a little more generous and perhaps a little more open-minded in looking at the Atlantis story, and above all should connect it to other traditions of civilizations destroyed in a global flood.
Okay, I want to give you two things I want to show. One,
That's the Temple of Horus at Edfu.
yeah, so Rob, can you play that clip and tell me how accurate this is with what you think of this, of the Atlantis? Go ahead, Rob. So this is, if you want to hit the volume as well, go ahead.
This is the Rishat structure.
Yes.
Sahara actually be the lost city of Atlantis. Plato's legend of Atlantis has long occupied the minds of everyone, from scientists to skeptics, with many locations being cited as a possibility for the location of this sunken
Look, I'll cut to the
civilization.
chase on this.
However,
I'm,
more specific.
I'm not in a place now where I'm going to say the Rishat structure was Atlantis, because it isn't an island, and that's very clear in Plato's story. A very large island was submerged. But secondly, the Rishat structure may be extremely interesting, and goodness knows what it has to tell us. I've not been there, and I don't like sort of pronouncing on places that I've not seen and studied myself. So if I were asked to put money on it right now, I would put money on the Rishat structure being natural. If I were able to go there and investigate it firsthand and have boots on the ground, I might change my view. But right now, I don't have enough information to say that this is a man-made structure.
Do you have an idea of where you think it's at?
Well, again, it's provided by Plato. It's west of the Pillars of Hercules, west of the Straits of Gibraltar. It's in the Atlantic Ocean. Oh, this is in Mauritania. It's in Mauritania in West Africa. The Rishat structure. And on land, and never been underwater. Not in the last few 100 million years. Anyway. But I don't want to diss it. I understand why people find this intriguing. It's an intriguing looking structure, my God, and it does, resemble that ring structure that is accorded to Atlantis. So I refuse to write it off completely, but at the same time, my work is under such hostile scrutiny by so many archaeologists at the moment that I'd be foolish to put money on something that I've not even seen for myself.
I was on my way to Vegas. I was hoping to get to that, but it's okay. So I'm on History Channel right now on their website. It's 6 theories about the Atlantis. Number 1, Atlantis was a mid-Atlantic continent that suddenly sunk into the ocean. This is the whole Plato theory. Number 2, the Atlantis was swallowed up by the Bermuda Triangle. That's number 2. Number 3, Atlantis was Antarctica. That's what this was. So this is the 1958 book, Earth's Shifting Crust.
Yep.
Albert Einstein, right? Okay.
Well, Albert Einstein wrote the introduction,
he
but it
wrote
was
the
by
foreword.
Charles Hapgood.
Right.
Yeah.
Number 4, the story of Atlantis was a mythical retelling of the Black Sea flood. Okay, so that's 1. And then next, Atlantis is the story of the Minoan civilization which flourished in the Greek island 2500 to 1600 BC. And the 6th one is Atlantis didn't exist at all. Plato invented it.
Yeah. That pretty much sums up the theories about Atlantis. None of those theories take account of the fact that Atlantis is a flood myth and that it is part of a global tradition of flood myths. I don't think that any of them provide a satisfactory example. The most interesting thing is that there are a number of places in the world which were radically changed by sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. It is possible that one of those places
I hate this
was
fucking
in
game, bro.
When there is a phenomenon called isostasy, where you have huge ice masses, and you did have enormous ice cap over North America, everywhere north of pretty much Minnesota, all the way up to Canada. The weight of these ice masses, which were at the peak about 2 kilometers deep, would have been enormous. And it pushed down on one. It's like a seesaw. You push down one bit, you raise up another bit. And it's possible that the mid-Atlantic ridge may have been higher as a result of the weight of the ice cap. That's called isostasy. Then when the ice caps come off, the seesaw shifts the other way. And what was above water ends up underwater. It's not only sea level rise that's involved, it's the mechanics of the Earth itself and the way that it's a slightly elastic surface that will allow weight to shift one thing. So for example, in the UK, where I live, there was an ice cap on northern Scotland during the Ice Age, and that pushed northern Scotland down and it pushed the south of England up. That's why the Isle of Wight in the English Channel is now sinking, because the ice cap's no longer there and the seesaw has gone back the other way. So you've got a combination of sea level rise and isostasy. It is possible, but there are other intriguing areas of the world. There's the Sunda Shelf, that's I mentioned earlier, the landmass that now on maps is the Malay Peninsula, the Malaysian Peninsula, the Indonesian islands. That landmass was all one landmass during the Ice Age. It wasn't a peninsula and a series of islands. It was called, geologists call it the Sunda Shelf or Sunda Land. And that was submerged very rapidly at the end of the last Ice Age, changed everything completely. So that is an interesting area to look, and I know a number of Indonesian researchers who think Indonesia may have been the site of Atlantis for that reason. South of India, fascinating. In Tamil Nadu, which is actually where my wife's family comes from. I'm fortunate to be. Yeah, my wife was born in Malaysia, but she's of Tamil origin, and she speaks fluent Tamil. So we were able to do a series of expeditions in southern India, talking to people about their traditions there. And it turns out that there is a deep and ancient tradition of a land called Kumari Kandam in southern India. A land that extended south from the tip of southern India, that Sri Lanka was not an island, but it was joined to India, and that parts of this land may have extended as far south as the Maldives. And there are traditions about sophisticated civilization there, which had academies of learning, they called them sangams. And this too was submerged in a global flood, and the date put on it is roughly 11,500 years ago. Meltwater pulse run big, the same sort of thing. So there's a number of candidates around the world for this. There we are, Kumari Kandam. That's the idea of it. And of course, archaeology won't have anything to do with it, but there it is.
Well, you said something when we talked about advanced technology. Like, well, I don't know about the advanced technology, what I'm not saying they had planes and they had this and they had that, but how did they find the Antarctica back in 1300, and then we say the first time we found out about it was in 1820s? It's a valid question to be asking, right? So do we have any insight or research or proof on the types of technology that may have existed in the past?
Well, yes, we do. This is one of the points that archaeology tends to skate around. Look, first of all, there isn't a single shipwreck that's been found anywhere in the world that is older than 6,000 years. The oldest shipwreck so far identified is the Dokos shipwreck from Greece, and it's about 6,000 years old. And you can go down from there to other shipwrecks about 3,300 years old in the Mediterranean. There's an intact shipwreck at the bottom of the Black Sea, which is about 2,400 years old. It's intact because there's no oxygen down there, almost 2 miles deep, and the timbers have been preserved. That's the Dokos shipwreck. It's a bit older than that. But anyway, that's the oldest known shipwreck in the world. So and this is used as an argument against a lost seafaring civilization of the Ice Age. The argument is, oh look, if there was a seafaring civilization that was able to map the whole Earth during the Ice Age, surely we'd find some of their ships. And the absence of ships is taken as proof that there was no seafaring civilization. Now, this is puzzling, because archaeologists universally accept that human beings were using ships 50,000 years ago. For example, it would have been impossible to settle the island of Cyprus even at the peak of the last ice age, even when sea level was at its lowest, it would have been impossible to settle it by land because it was always an island. Cyprus is surrounded by great deeps. You could only have got to it by ships. None of those ships have ever been found, but we know for sure that human beings were living in Cyprus at least 12,500 years ago during the Ice Age. And the studies that have been done suggest that quite sophisticated ships must have been used, that there were planned settlement of Cyprus, that people numbering 1,000 or more were moved over to Cyprus from the mainland in a series of expeditions. They brought animals with them. They had to have a population large enough to avoid extinction. You go with too small a population and they may become extinct within a generation or two. So everybody accepts that Cyprus was colonized by sea during the Ice Age, but no ships have survived. That doesn't dispute the fact that it was colonized by sea. Same with Australia. Human beings were in Australia at least 50,000 years ago. And even at the peak of the Ice Age, when the whole Sunda Shelf was still above water, you got as far as Timor, and then you had to sail. There's a 90-kilometer gap between Timor and New Guinea, which would only have been covered by watercraft. And again, no watercraft have been found, but that doesn't invalidate the fact that human beings got there. So the absence of shipwrecks from quote-unquote my lost civilization of the Ice Age doesn't worry me, because there's absence of shipwrecks much older, which, you know, in theory, if we've not found shipwrecks from 50,000 years ago, that means that nobody settled Australia. But people did settle Australia.
So what's your point? Let me go with that. When I ask you a question about what type of technology that we have and what proofs are there, you're saying that, you know...
I'm saying that even within established archaeology, it is accepted that sophisticated navigation technology existed 50,000 years ago. Ships,
specifically ships. Okay.
Ships,
what else?
Ships, which were capable of carrying not just 2 or 3 individuals, but dozens or hundreds of individuals.
What else? What else do we have proof that existed back in the days where, you know, we can sit and point to it and be like, wow, it's pretty interesting. We used to have this back then. It's pretty wild. What else do we have? Proof of technology.
Well, I think the Great Sphinx is one of the surviving remnants of that period.
Is that technology, though?
Well, yes, it is, because the Great Sphinx is cut out of natural bedrock. And I mentioned to you a megalithic temple that stands right beside the Great Sphinx with blocks weighing 100 tons or more. Those blocks came out of the trench around the Sphinx that was excavated around the Sphinx to create the body of the Sphinx. So this was a culture that was able to cut 100-ton blocks out of the bedrock and move them over and build them into a temple.
What are some speculations of what it could be?
Well, again, this is a subject that mainstream establishment archaeology avoids as to how this was all done, and they keep going back to the wet sand and the sledges and the teams of men, and some people will even say slaves were involved in moving the blocks, although there's no evidence of slavery in the Old Kingdom and ancient Egypt. There's no really good explanation for it in establishment Egyptology. In ancient Egypt, in ancient Egyptian myth and tradition, which are mirrored by many myths and traditions around the world, and this is where I get myself into a lot of trouble with archaeologists. There are traditions of priests singing blocks, singing megaliths into place, huge blocks of stone being raised up into the sky by priests chanting. And I just wonder whether that's some faint memory passed down over the millennia of some kind of sonic technology that may have been used to lift blocks. But that's purely a speculation on my part. I have no proof of that whatsoever, but I don't think Egyptologists have got any proof either of how some of these things were done.
What's the movie? There was a movie that showed types of technology that may have existed years ago. And then there was an explosion or a meteor that hit, and then boom, we started all over again. Do you at all subscribe that being a possibility?
Well, that's precisely the possibility that I think we're looking at. I think that there was a higher level of technology, particularly in shipbuilding, than is supposed to have existed. Navigation, exploration of the world, longitude, precise astronomy that is not supposed to have been discovered until the time of the Greeks, say 2,000 or 2,300 years ago, but which was present during the Ice Age.
Yeah, because when you see some of the stuff that we're building today, and how advanced we are right now, and it seems like the last 4 years, the acceleration of advancement is just out of control.
Out of control. Really, really rapid acceleration.
Does that concern you or no?
No, because it's the nature of human culture. Human cultures can stay stagnant for centuries, and then they can suddenly leap forward. And we're looking at one of those sudden leaps forward in our time. I mean, even within my own living and working memory, when I started out as a journalist in the 1970s, there were no computers. I was typing on a little portable typewriter, and when I made mistakes, I would use a thing called Tipex to paint out what I typed and type over it again. And you had a carbon copy at the back. It was very slow and laborious, and if you wanted to gather detailed academic information, you're going to have to definitely go to a library and access that information there. But within those years, since the 1970s, that's all changed. Now we have incredible access to resources of information through the internet. And as a writer, I find the word processing technology incredibly useful. I first got onto it about 1982. That's when I got my first computer. And it was like just an amazing liberation. I don't have to Tipex out anything else. If I don't like that word, I can just remove it and replace it with another one. It made the writing process much less physical and much more visceral. You just get right into what you want to say, and if you want to change it, it's so easy to change it. That's a change in our lifetime. Look at the whole thing of artificial intelligence that's happening right now. We are going through an inflection point in the human story, and the question is, will we survive it or not? I'm less worried about the technologies like AI than I am worried about the well-known technology of nuclear weapons. That technology worries me a lot because the fact of the matter is that we are living at a point of so much hostility and so much hatred and so much anger in the world that it is not impossible that nuclear missiles will be fired, perhaps even within our lifetime. And why does that happen? That happens because the leaders of the world, the governments of the world, they all have the psychology of 14-year-old teenage males.
Why do you say that?
Because they're just constantly engaged in warfare and anger and ego contests with one another. They are not, their level of consciousness is not mature enough to have the ability to control weapons that could destroy the whole of civilization in a single day. We have put in the hands of these naughty teenagers the weapons of gods. And that is a very dangerous place to be. We need an elevation of consciousness amongst our leaders in order to make the world a safer place. And perhaps the first thing that would happen with that elevation of consciousness would be less hostility, less fury, less anger, and an elimination entirely of nuclear weapons. Nobody has nuclear weapons because they want to attack other people. We have nuclear weapons because we think we want to defend ourselves. But what a terrible way to defend ourselves if it means that humanity dies out completely. It's obviously an insane idea. Well, it's called MAD, mutually assured destruction. And that is a result of a state of mind that lives in fear and that has not fully conquered its own emotions and is unwilling to seek friendship when hostility is an easier option. That was fine when we had swords and spears. It was even fine when it was just machine guns and rifles. But now that we've got nukes, it's not fine anymore. And we're possibly the first civilization on this planet that could be responsible for its own complete destruction. There would be survivors, if there were survivors, from North America or Britain, Northern Europe. They'd be wise to take refuge amongst the few remaining hunter-gatherer populations in the world today. Because the one thing about hunter-gatherers is that these are people who know how to survive. Those of us in technological societies, many of us haven't got a clue about how to survive. We just don't know how to do it. And we'd be psychologically destroyed by the collapse of our civilization. We would fall to pieces. The only people in the world who would pass through such a disaster relatively intact would be, for example, the hunter-gatherers in the Amazon rainforest. And I'm kind of suggesting that's what happened at the end of the Ice Age too. Just as we would take refuge amongst hunter-gatherer communities, perhaps share with them some of what we knew, and at the same time they're sharing with us what they know so that we can survive in their jungle. I think the same thing happened in the past too.
Are you open to the idea the next time Randall comes on that we do it together for 4 hours?
I'd love to.
Okay, so why don't we do next time together for Rob? The next
What
one,
the
let's
fuck
do
was that?
the 3 of us, but let's put it for 4 hours for us to just free flow and go through a bunch of different topics because I just had what is it when you just feel like this has happened before?
Deja vu.
I just had deja vu. I'm like, I want both of you guys here to entertain this conversation together. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think
Randall is a genius in that.
I mean, listen, the stuff we talked about with Randall, we went one topic on Freemason. We stayed there for like 40 minutes. And that's not even why he was here. I don't want to talk about Freeman. I wanted to talk about other things. But because he's a 32nd degree or something like that, we stayed on that topic for a while. And
Yeah, I believe he's a Mason.
yeah, I believe is one. And my first sergeant in the Army used to be one, so I was always fascinated by that.
I'm not a Freemason myself. I've known a number of Freemasons over the years, and those I've known have always been very open-minded, inquiring.
Me too. I have good experience with them. I don't have anything. I'm a math guy myself, and to me, when I think about more people who want to use logic to make their argument, I support it. I think it's great to be able to use that. Meanwhile, to be able to question stuff. Anyways, it is a pleasure to have you here. We're going to put the links, Rob, to the books and the shows.
Yeah, well, just to spell that out, I hope people will watch my season 2 on Netflix, which launches on the 16th of October.
Yep.
And that's season 1 we're looking at there, but season 2 launches on the 16th of October. Please look at my website, grahamhancock.com, which also will have all the links. It has the links to my video fact-checking Flint Dibble. It has the links to the only talk that I'm going to be giving in the USA next year, which will be in April in Sedona. By the way, that might be a good time to do this joint show with Randall that you're talking about.
Fantastic.
Because I know I'll be here next year.
Then let's do that. Let's
April
look at
19th
April.
and 20th.
I know this is in Austin, but this is the second greatest city in America. I'm joking.
Yeah.
I'm giving you a hard time because of the conversation we had earlier.
Yeah.
No, but it's been a blast having you on. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for coming.
Delight to be with you too. Thank you for having me on the show.
Anytime. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
You're going to think I'm crazy when I tell you this, but the last 13 and a half years I've been working on my first fiction book to write, ever. Fiction book to write. And while I finished this book, a year ago, I got the strangest phone call about one of the characters in the book where the guy wanted to meet with me and he read the book. And afterwards he's like, wait a minute, am I the villain in the book? This is a story about a character named Asher, who is half Armenian, half Assyrian, whose father was involved in the Iranian Revolution, linked to Sabah, working with the Shah, that they escape and he gets recruited to a secret society. Well, when you go to the secret society, it's been around for a couple thousand years. They've developed some of the craziest leaders of all time. And they test you. There's unique tests that they have at this society where they test to see your emotional mental toughness. One of the tests that they have is very rigorous. It's purely mental. Of course, there's a physical one, but one is mental and emotional. If you're Armenian, if you're Syrian, if you're Persian, this is a book you're going to be reading and saying, holy moly, this is the kind of stuff you talk about in here? Yes. If you're somebody that's fascinated by history, this is a book for you. Characters. There's a technology that this society, secret society, builds where you go into a vault. I won't spoil it for you. When you go down, they have a technology where you get to sit down and watch and have a 3-4 hour conversation with Tupac. You can set up a debate between Karl Marx and Ayn Rand. Karl Marx is in the book, who wrote Communist Manifesto. Ayn Rand, who wrote Atlas Shrugged, is in the book. Marilyn Monroe explains the concept of seduction and sex in it. When you read the book, it's about development of the next leaders in the world and how they do it, and how they've been doing it for many years. And it's also about how to prevent the end of civilization and how this organization goes about doing it. So, I've never written a parenting book before, but if I ever wrote a parenting book, this is the closest thing to it because it's all mindset, a lot of crazy stories. Again, 13 and a half years. Trust me, I told myself I will not publish this book until I sell my insurance company and I'm fully disconnected from it, where it's no longer my responsibility 100%. When you read this, if you're a creative person, if you like fiction books, if you enjoyed Atlas Shrugged, or if you enjoy Divergent, if you like books like that, I think you're gonna enjoy reading this book. It's the creative side. Business books is very easy. Here's how you do it, here's how this how it works. This is very creative. If you haven't placed the order yet, now you can order it on Simon & Schuster, Amazon. I'm going to put the link up below somewhere here, maybe even in my profile. Go order the book and read it. I've never written a book where I can't wait to read your reviews to see what you think about this book. So I'm going on this wild journey, and we have some plans with this book here. If you support the things that I work on, I would appreciate you going and reading the book, order the book on Amazon, and then post a review.
Yo, Ninja Lifestyle, what's up, brother? What's up, Big Ninja, man? What's up, man? Oh my god, why? Yo, what's up, buddy? No, I did not, my dude. I did not, my friend. I did not, my dude. How are you, man?
We're the next lost civilization. That's what.
I'm gonna use the washroom. That's all Aztec. Yep.
But choices need to.
No, it is. But I'm playing really well. I'm playing really well, dude. I'm using the washroom. I'm gonna load the vape. Take like a 5-10 minute break.
Otherwise, it's not even going to take.
Oh my god. What do you mean? Hope you're doing well, dude.
Yeah.
Collapse and destroy our civilization, lose all the support systems that we've relied upon, and be put in a place where we have to rely only on ourselves again. That would be very difficult.
Yep.
That's why I think our civilization today is fragile, because it looks strong. It's capable of incredible technological feats, but psychically, it's very fragile and not ready to confront the chaos that may come.
I've been looking forward to having a podcast with Graham Hancock for over a decade now, since I first became familiar with his work. And this podcast did not disappoint. We talked about everything I wanted to talk to Graham about, including some of the information that I received from Matthias DeStefano, which posits the actual mechanism behind some of these magnificent megaliths.
Alright, I'll be back in like 5-10 minutes, maybe more.
So we go through that whole story.
Sorry, I need to
and really
fucking
share and
regroup.
converse with what I've received from Matthias and what he's discovered from being on the ground and all the research that he's put into it for
thanks, brother.
his life's work in a big way, in addition to the great fiction works that we also discuss, and also the surprising blowback that he's received from mainstream culture, which is both surprising and not surprising given the current zeitgeist. We also talk about psychedelics and posit the potential reality of darker forces that exist that have been
Thanks,
pointed to
brother.
from the Gnostic
Thank you, man. I
traditions,
appreciate
which he's
that,
very
dude. I
familiar
appreciate
with.
you.
So this
a
is
friend.
a wide-ranging
Hope
conversation
you're doing well, man.
that covers a variety
buddy.
of different topics, and I'm just thrilled to be able to share it with all of you. So please enjoy this podcast with Graham Hancock. Graham Hancock, this has been a while in the making. Such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Nice to be with you, Aubrey. I wish I could be present with you in person, but this has just been a
hear
hectic
that.
trip
Thanks,
across
man.
the
Thank
US
you,
for me.
I understand. Your show is such a hit. Congratulations. I mean, #1 show on Netflix.
Thank you. Yeah. It's called Ancient Apocalypse. It has been doing very well. I'm happy that it's held up because Netflix release hundreds of new shows every week, and what was particularly pleasing was that for a while it was #2 of all television shows on Netflix, including dramas like The Crown, which are enormously popular. It's unusual for a docuseries to get that much attention, but obviously I'm happy about that. At the same time, it's brought down a shitstorm of criticism on my head.
Yeah, it's simultaneously the vindication of people who are highly interested and really enjoying your work, and then the establishment that is obviously aroused into some rancor here.
Indeed so.
So if you could, our audience, is probably pretty familiar with your theory and your work. So just so people have a landscape quickly about what your primary thesis is in this ancient apocalypse also was the topic of Magicians of the Gods, which I remember reading when it came out. Outstanding, both of those bodies of work. But if you could just give a brief summary for those people who either want to be refreshed or aren't familiar with the thesis that you're talking about in these works?
Well, what I've been looking into for the past 30 years plus has been the possibility of a major forgotten episode in the human story. And that is a lost civilization that flourished during the Ice Age, but that was almost completely destroyed in the series of cataclysms that brought the Ice Age to an end between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. And in geological terms, and indeed human terms, that's very recent. I'm not talking about a high-tech civilization. Certainly not. We should not be looking for us, for ourselves in the past. I'm not talking about cell phones. I'm not talking about rockets going to the moon. I'm talking about a civilization that mapped the Earth, that explored the world, that was primarily based upon coastlines which are now flooded beneath the 400-foot sea level rise that took place at the end of the Ice Age, and which had a deep understanding of astronomy and geometry. I would say at least equivalent to Western civilization's understanding in the mid to late 18th century. So I want to be clear. I'm not talking about what we might regard as an advanced civilization in terms of technology. I'm talking about an advanced civilization in terms of a level of knowledge that is not normally attributed to Ice Age populations. And I'm also suggesting that I'll use the word advanced, that advanced civilization coexisted with the hunter-gatherer populations, who we know for sure were also present in the world at that time. And this is often assumed to be a rather bizarre idea until we remember that our own civilization today, if we can even call it a civilization anymore, our own civilization today coexists still with hunter-gatherer peoples, particularly in the Amazon rainforest, where there are hunter-gatherer groups who don't even know that we exist, but also in places like the Namibian desert, where the San hunter-gatherers pursue a very different way of life to our own, yet these lifeways coexist, and I'm suggesting that this was the case during the Ice Age as well.
When you go through and you watch Ancient Apocalypse and go through each of these different sites, it becomes very difficult to imagine how the evidence that you're presenting is actually refuted. You know, this is the interesting thing about your work is it's so persuasive when you actually start looking at everything collectively and start to weave this global picture of what happened, that it's consistently surprising to me to see people, you know, attacking it. And it's not surprising from a psychological perspective, I understand it, but the preponderance of evidence that you're providing is really enormous as you go through all of these different sacred sites. And then there's that, you know, the black layer of death that you find in the rocks, and there's just so many different things. But if you had to steel man their argument, the mainstream narrative argument, if you had to steel man it and say, like, all right, this is the best refutation of this collective thesis that I have, what would you say is their steel man argument?
I haven't seen a really effective refutation. And by the way, I'd like to add that the Ancient Apocalypse docuseries builds upon more than 30 years of work in my books. Inevitably, when you're making a docuseries where episodes are half an hour long, even in 8 episodes, it's not possible to represent the entire body of evidence upon which I rely. But it's interesting that the reactions to it by the mainstream have not, by and large, got to grips with what I'm proposing, but have simply been a deluge of insults and ad hominem attacks, particularly accusing me of promoting racism and white supremacy. Although race is not mentioned ever in Ancient Apocalypse, that is the most common attack that is made on my work, and I find that personally hurtful, since I'm married to a woman of color, and since I have 7 mixed race grandchildren.
who will be exposed to these kind of lies that are being spread about me in order to cancel me, in order to get people to just turn off and not even give my work a chance. And I think that shows a kind of desperation and also lack of moral rigor on the part of those who wish to see my work shut down.
This seems to be symptomatic of something that's in society right now, where actual discourse between opposing sides has been completely forgotten. This old idea of the Marquis de Queensberry of debate, right? Like where we had some. There's none of that anymore. It's just whatever the lowest blow, whatever the most hurtful thing that one side can say, without even addressing the issue. It seems like we've been in this race to the bottom. It's actually. Archaeology is typically a cool corner of the science debate and of popular culture, but even in this, it seems like you challenge empire or the narrative, you challenge the mainstream anywhere, and they take it as a threat everywhere. It seems is what we're experiencing.
That's right. And although in some ways you're right to say that archaeology is a cool corner of this, that there's not been too much heated debate. It's important to remember that archaeology claims to hold the keys to the human past, and it claims to hold sole ownership of the human past. I think this is part of the reason why the reaction to my work has been so intense, because I'm not an archaeologist. I've never claimed to be an archaeologist. I'm a journalist with an interest in investigating subjects that some people prefer to avoid. And in my case, that subject has been the prehistory of humanity. And somehow it seems outrageous to the key holders that an outsider should come in and say they may have missed something incredibly important. They often claim that I'm claiming that there's some sort of conspiracy theory, some sort of conspiracy in archaeology, and in addition to being told that I'm promoting racism and white supremacy, I'm also being told that I'm promoting conspiracy theories. But I don't claim any conspiracy in archaeology. I think archaeology is simply working the way that most disciplines work, that they get locked into a particular point of view. The right word for that is a paradigm. That paradigm governs how they react to new data, that the tendency, once you're locked into a particular worldview and a particular paradigm, is to defend that to the death in every way that you can. Your career depends upon it. The applause of your colleagues depends upon it. Research funding depends upon it. There are so many examples. I give many of them in my 2019 book, America Before. There are so many examples of archaeologists who have stepped outside the narrow bounds of accepted theory in
Well, I
archaeology,
think I'm going to have some dinner now. I'm going to keep
Gyges on
streaming, but
Mars,
I'm going to do longer than
Bluefish
5 minutes.
Cave in the Yukon, who back in the 80s was proposing that human beings had been in the Americas at least 24,000 years ago. And this went against the then prevailing narrative that was called Clovis First, which held that there had been no humans in the Americas until around 13,400 years ago. Well, instead of actually investigating Gyges on Mars findings, the Academy turned upon him viciously. All his research funding was stripped away. He was humiliated at conferences. Former friends would pass him by in corridors and completely ignore him. He was snubbed in every possible way, and huge efforts were made to discredit his work. But you know what? He was right. Back in 2021, the evidence came out that he'd been absolutely right at Bluefish Caves, and that human beings had been there 24,000 years ago. And now, of course, we know that the whole Clovis First narrative is bust. A complete nonsense, that human beings have been in America even longer than 24,000 years ago. I cite evidence in that 2019 book, America Before, of humans being in the Americas 130,000 years ago, 10 times as long as the Clovis, so-called Clovis culture. And that evidence doesn't come actually from outside archaeology. It comes from a leading group of archaeologists at the University of San Diego. and it's on display in the San Diego Natural History Museum. They found evidence of human tool use, slaughtering and butchering a mastodon 130,000 years ago, just south of San Diego. And again, rather than consider the implications of this, the response of the rest of archaeology has been to dismiss it, sneer in it, deny that it's possible, on the grounds that, okay, we were wrong about Clovis, but we don't accept that human beings have been in the Americas for more than 30,000 years. So somebody saying humans have been in the Americas for 130,000 years has just got to be wrong. And this is just so unfortunate that there's this aspect of science which, instead of responding with curiosity to new evidence and new claims, just tries to shut those down. And this is greatly to the disadvantage of science in the long run. But, and I'll complete this long rant in a moment, but in the long run, it is the case with all paradigms that eventually the evidence that cannot be explained by the paradigm builds up to such a level that it becomes ridiculous to keep faith in the old paradigm. And that's when paradigms shift and we have a revolution in science taking place. And that has happened a number of times in the past. And I believe it's going to happen over our understanding of the prehistory of humanity as well.
Yeah, it kind of evokes the image of tectonic plates that are kind of stuck, and they want to move, but they're kind of frozen, and the paradigm's frozen, and then they finally move, and there's a big earthquake, and it frees it up, and everything shakes, and a lot of things topple, and then everything settles on the backside of it.
Then a new paradigm forms, and that becomes the conventional wisdom, the accepted knowledge for a period of time, and then very often that new paradigm will also be overthrown by.
I just have a feeling though that if someone comes to overthrow your paradigm with new evidence, and you're a great grandfather out there somewhere, you won't look at them the same way that the narrative currently is looking at you. I think there's a flexibility of mind that we really need to evolve as a species, because what you're talking about has been seen in every different field of science. I mean, take the example of Ignace Semmelweis, right, who worked in OBGYN and noticed that hand washing had a significant impact on the survivability of mothers and children in this process. And then he was literally thrown in an insane asylum and beaten to death, dying of sepsis, probably from the wounds that weren't clean from dirty hands, right? Like, the irony of this, and then given a Nobel Prize, posthumously for his work. But there's so many examples of that, where someone comes up with a theory, and they're just completely ousted and attacked. And this is symptomatic of something that needs to shift.
I hope if somebody presented compelling evidence that I'm wrong, that there may have been another kind of civilization present in the world during the Ice Age as well as hunter-gatherers, I hope that if somebody came up with really compelling evidence of that, then I would be open to consider it. I'm human. I'm filled with error also. I also get stuck in my own rut. There's no doubt about that. But I would want to be open to that. The problem is that no such compelling evidence has been presented. It's just really straightforward dismissals, appeals to authority, saying Hancock doesn't know what he's talking about. Hancock isn't an archaeologist. How dare he even suggest this? A journalist in the Guardian newspaper in England asked actually why Netflix had allowed the series, as though people are not capable of making up their own minds. This is part of the problem with this outlook of the so-called experts in our society, is that they despise the man and the woman in the street. And don't believe that they're capable of reaching rational decisions about things without being told what to think. And I find myself more and more embroiled in this. It's a much bigger debate than just a debate about the possibility of a lost civilization. It's a debate about free thinking and free speech in our society today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It almost seems like there's this energy that you could almost, if you wanted to take some of the mythological minds of our past, you could deify it, and it would be this kind of stuck, judgmental, kind of demonic entity. And I'm not suggesting that this exists actually, but there's this energy that people are participating in that is actually an energy that needs to deeply, deeply evolve, you know, and really it has to evolve in all of our minds as we participate in that energy ourselves to whatever small degree that we do. And it seems like if we don't, society's going to really suffer.
Absolutely. I think we are at one of those turning points in the human story right now. You know, what is needed is a more loving, more open, more caring view, rather than just these constant attempts at character assassination from anybody who disagrees with the mainstream. And look where the so-called experts have got us over the years. Whether they're experts in science, whether there are so-called political leaders who are just a bunch of absolute arseholes, not qualified to lead anything but stirring up hatred and fear and suspicion in our society. We need to move on from this tribal mindset. There may have been a time when a tribal mindset was a good thing to have, but in this interconnected world that we live in today, it's leading to real horrors taking place. I think we need to, I want to make clear that I'm completely against government, and especially I just don't see the point of government at all. So many of the problems in our world are caused by very bad leadership, and I'm especially against the notion of a one world government. I detest and hate that idea. I want to see as little government as possible. And if I were to characterize myself as anything, I would say I'm an anarchist, which is literally means without government. But what is needed is rather than having this tribal and nationalistic mindset, let's recognize the beauty and the diversity of human culture. Let's recognize that this diversity is a wonderful thing, that it adds to the depth and value of the human experience. But let's not go on defining our tribe as the best and every other tribe as the worst. Let's not set ourselves up against one another in this way. It's been my privilege to travel the world extensively for almost all my adult life, and to live in a number of different countries and to get deeply acquainted with a number of different cultures. And what I've found, it should be a commonplace, that people are absolutely the same all over the world. Skin color is completely unimportant. Even gender is unimportant. People are fundamentally the same. We have the same hopes, the same dreams. We all love our kids in the same way. We all want to make something of our lives. It doesn't matter, you know, whether you're a hunter-gatherer in Namibia or a banker in New York. Fundamentals are all the same. And I think it's time that we stopped using tribal mentalities and recognize that we're all part of one great human family. Rather than patriotism, we should have loyalty to the whole human race. And I repeat, that does not mean a one world government. That means much less government and human beings relating to each other rather than allowing governments and leaders to stir up hatred and fear and suspicion amongst us.
It seems that people who might be skeptical of the human goodness and whether we have the consciousness to actually live peacefully amongst ourselves without government, we may be underestimating the impact that the structures of empire, that government is actually having on degrading our own goodness and degrading our own consciousness by enforcing their tyranny and actually enforcing these crazy laws and rules and stirring up this divisiveness and hatred and patterning it for us the most deplorable behavior. We may be actually underestimating the impact that government is having, and then also underestimating the goodness of people if we actually removed this force. And I'm not saying remove it like go, you know, Antifa, and I know you're not saying that either. It's not like attack the government. It's the opposite of that. It's just saying like let go of the talons that you have into the goodness of humanity.
Yeah, and of course it's in the interests of all governing powers to persuade us, the people, that we can't function without them. And they very cleverly use our money in PR campaigns in order to explain, to persuade us of that. And I've found that many people take for granted that the human race couldn't function without governments. But that, in my view, is simply not true. We are being told a story here. And far from keeping the peace, I see governments as generating war, because that's in their interests. If they make us hate our neighbors, if they make us hate other cultures and fear other cultures, then that strengthens their hand.
So I'm gonna tell you a wild story, and if people accuse you of wild stories, then they're gonna accuse me of even wilder stories. So maybe I can take a few arrows here for you and take a little pressure off people slinging rocks at you. So I've become quite close friends with a gentleman named Matthias de Stefano, and he remembers many of his past lives. The most notable of which was he was a mother in a civilization he calls Chem, which was in the Nile Basin, and he
Ancient name for Egypt.
yeah, and he was there roughly, at the end of the final spasms of the Ice Age, 9600 BC. He was there right as civilization started to repopulate after the floods and after the cataclysms. And so he wasn't there in Atlantis, but his descendants were Atlantean. So, and Atlantis to him there was one central Atlantis, but there was many actual outposts in different cities, all in water regions, right? They were a seafaring culture, and they were in a variety of different places. And then, as the theory really, everything that he remembers, all the stories that he was told, and they would write maps of the stars and do so many things that actually corresponded with everything you were saying. But as you were saying, the meteors came and they started striking the earth in many different places, and the water started to rise.
Yep.
There was some immediate destruction, but most of the Atlantean actually culture was able to spread and disperse. So it wasn't like, I think we see images on movies and TV where Atlantis was just destroyed in a minute. Actually, a lot of them, thousands, tens of thousands, were able to get onto boats and travel to different sites around the world, and higher ground sites. And he describes the civilizations as megalithic, but not advanced. They were still riding around in donkeys, but they had these giant megaliths. And the technology that they had was a spiritual technology. And they had 4 different guilds that were correlated to the elements. So they had the water guild, and this is what passed down from the Atlantean culture. And they had the water guild, the earth guild, the air guild, and the fire guild. And they practiced in these deep spiritual training with psychedelic compounds and with all of the different advantages that they had. And what he was a part of the water guild. And what the water guild would do was, the water guild was involved in actually cutting the stones. So they would drip water in a line across the stones, and then they would form resin. They would get in resonance with the water and actually use the water to actually cut the stones. So some of the smooth cuts of these stones that don't look like they had chisel work, the explanation for him is, they were using water. And of course this is wild, and our field of belief wouldn't even open.
It's only wild because we've been schooled to think that such ideas
Exactly.
are
Exactly.
There's actually nothing particularly wild about it, because we really are quite ignorant of the mystery of consciousness and what it is to be a human being. I mean, many mainstream scientists will say, gosh, somebody's speaking about reincarnation. What rubbish. There's no such thing as reincarnation. But how can they possibly know that?
Also, the University of Virginia has over 2,000 case studies that they.
Ian Stevenson, I think, was the lead figure in investigating that. He went. You see, our culture, Western culture, is profoundly materialistic, and it utterly rejects any idea of reincarnation. Because that implies that there's some non-material aspect of consciousness which can survive death and can be reborn in a body, and that just flies completely in the face of the whole materialistic bias of Western culture. And as a result, children brought up in Western culture are subjected to this ideology of materialism from a very early age. But what Ian Stevenson found is that up to the age of about 7, and he documented this in an extremely scientific way, up to the Children Who Remember Past Lives is the title of the book, up to the age of about 7, many children in many different cultures have memories of past lives. But in Western culture, those memories are discouraged by their parents and by their education system. So Stevenson went to India, where there is not this discouragement of belief in past lives. And he began interviewing young children there, and he found astonishing evidence. Again, it's fully published and fully documented in his book, Children Who Remember Past Lives. He found absolutely compelling evidence that reincarnation did take place. Kids who would remember being born in a village 300 miles away, who would know of a certain object hidden under the eaves of a house in that place where they had once lived, he was able to go and test that. And again, the establishment, the academy has just reacted to this with derision because it doesn't fit their paradigm. But what do they know, and what do we know really about the human creature? We're just beginning to scratch the surface. Consciousness is such a huge mystery of science. And fundamentally, when we talk about reincarnation, we're talking about consciousness surviving physical death and passing on. And to me, that makes a great deal of sense. And I don't think it should be sneered at. I think it's something that's worthy of further investigation. So I'm very interested to hear the story that you're telling about Matthias Di Stefano, particularly since what he's remembering accords very much with good geological evidence of what happened at the end of the ice.
Absolutely.
And particularly so since I also think that Atlantis wasn't one place. It was distributed around the best real estate on Earth, the coastal lands, during the ice age. And it may have taken a principled position not to interfere with the lives of other cultures that it coexisted with, or to have minimal contact with them. But when the cataclysm came, when those coastlines were flooded, when that civilization began to go down, there certainly were survivors, large numbers of survivors. And the places that they took refuge were amongst hunter-gatherer populations. And I've made this point a number of times before, but if our civilization today were to collapse, and I think that's a real possibility, if it were to fall apart completely, because it's such a fragile civilization, really. I mean, very few people in our civilization have the faintest clue about how to survive. I'm one of them, actually. The only people on planet Earth who really have got the business of survival in adverse circumstances totally nailed down are the hunter-gatherers. They're the ones who actually know how to survive. And it would be quite natural for survivors of our so-called advanced civilization to take refuge amongst hunter-gatherer populations and learn from them, and at the same time perhaps teach them some of what we know.
Ninja, thank you for the bits, brother.
Really
I think I got another half hour in me of this level and game tonight. You another half hour go.
Has had past life experiences in this
Might switch to Zelda again.
Absolutely. And just to go back on the idea of the existence of a discarnate element of who we are, I went into my first psychedelic ceremony, this vision quest, which I was very blessed to be linked up with a proper shaman when I was 18, just graduated high school. And I was super anti-religion at that point. I'd gone to Texas and I'd seen how none of the religious doctrines that had been kind of pushed towards me had made any sense. I'd been to the dungeons of the Inquisition in Italy on a family trip and was horrified, and I was like, this is all nonsense. I was very much materialist, rationalist, reductionist. And I went and did my first journey, which was a combination of psilocybin and MDMA, and I felt my body completely evaporate. And there was no other word I had for what remained than the soul, the unborn, the undying element of who I am beyond this one lifetime. And that changed everything for me. There was no way I could dispute it. There's no way my mind. I stayed up all night that night. It was a rainy, windy night. Stayed up all night just writing in my journal because it was that moment of a radical earthquake paradigm shift from this.
And that paradigm shift, if I may intervene, came from an experience that you had. It didn't come from something you were taught in school or in university. It came from a direct personal experience, so much more valuable.
Yeah, and no one can ever tell me what it was and what it wasn't. I was there. I felt it, and I think this is one of the advantages of psychedelics is they give you the opportunity for gnosis, to actually experience what you're thinking about and philosophizing about.
I completely agree. This is, again, psychedelics are a subject that has been for far too long demonized in our society.
Oh, man.
We're beginning now to wake up to the incredible therapeutic benefits of psychedelics. That people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder or depression can be very quickly healed with just a relatively small number of deep psychedelic experiences, whereas the big pharma drugs do nothing for them. So there's a beginning of an awakening which is shifting the paradigm on psychedelics, but they're still regarded as in some way hazardous or dangerous. But let's ask ourselves, why are they so effective in curing PTSD and depression? In both cases, PTSD and depression, the affected individual is locked into a very rigid frame and can't see out beyond it. They get trapped in a recurring loop of unpleasantness. And what the psychedelics do is they break that loop. They allow the mind to reset and to contemplate possibilities that haven't been contemplated before. It's also true with people who are experiencing anxiety at the prospect of death, typically people with terminal cancer diagnoses. They've also had their last weeks or months transformed by experiences with psilocybin. Those experiences have shown them that the death of the physical body is really nothing, that it's not the end, that it might be the beginning of another great adventure. And what we are fundamentally is consciousness. And that's why I regard our society's reaction to psychedelics, until this relatively recent research has begun to get a toehold, our society's reaction to psychedelics, and still the case in most countries and most states, has been to make psychedelics illegal, to demonize them, to threaten those who use them with prison, and to defame their names. And yet, again, this is a point that I regard as extremely important. If we're not sovereign over our own consciousness, then we're not sovereign over anything. And it's impossible to speak about freedom when the government holds the keys to our consciousness and tells us what we may or may not experience. And then, of course, the flack will come back, and they'll say, oh, but psychedelics lead people to do things that are dangerous to others. Well, actually, first of all, they don't. And secondly, we already have laws that deal with people who do dangerous things to others. So we don't need laws that control the inner sanctum of our consciousness. There's just so much wrong with the way this issue has been handled in the modern world. And my only hope is that it doesn't get completely taken over by big pharma. That other dead hand doesn't step in. And I know already of pharmaceutical companies who are taking out patents on slightly tweaked molecules in order to make it their own when nature provides it free of charge to all of us.
Yeah, so many powerful thoughts, and I absolutely, unequivocally agree with you in all of this. And it's really, there's an upside down way of thinking. They think of it as not being sober, when actually on these medicines it feels like a hyper sobriety, like you've kind of woken up from the delusional dream that you've been in your waking reality. So it's almost not being sober, it's actually being more sober than you ever were. And it's not I may harm other people. Yeah. It's not I may harm other people. It's actually, if every time you've been an asshole is then shown right in your face, and you have to deal right in your face, and you have to deal with every time you've said something mean or hurt somebody or been thoughtless, you're really, it's your conscience. It's your consciousness.
These plant and fungi medicines are real teachers. They teach us the mistakes we've made, which we've normally blocked out because we don't want to hear about our own mistakes. They force us to confront them. And that gives us the opportunity not to repeat those mistakes in the future. These are incredibly helpful medicines. And apropos of the word sober, I mean, look at the one consciousness altering drug that's particularly valued and glorified in our society, which is alcohol. Alcohol is truly a dangerous drug. It leads people into very aggressive behavior. It gets them into fights. It leads to car smashes. It destroys the liver. It's a huge health risk. And yet, and fundamentally, People do not drink that glass of wine or that can of beer because of the taste. They may like the taste, but they're fundamentally drinking it because of the brief alteration of consciousness that it brings to them. The most boring drug on the planet is glorified by our civilization, and it's a consciousness-altering drug. But yet other consciousness-altering substances, which lead us to question the mainstream narrative, and psychedelics are paramount amongst those substances. Those have been demonized for so long. I hope we're going to see the end of that period of suppression, but I suspect it's still several years away.
Yeah, I think the psychedelics are playing a role in this as they become more, adopted mainstream. Our societies, the mental health of our society has been in a steady decline, and these psychedelics are providing a solution. So people may go in to work on their depression or their anxiety or their PTSD. Say, I'm going to go get this treatment. Oh, whoops! I just met with God. I just found the eternal existence of my soul as a side effect of my anxiety, which I totally forgot about because now my whole world is different. And I don't think I'm going to die and go to nothing anymore. And I think this is going to happen more and more, where people are going to treat some medical condition, which will be proven to be able to be treated by these things. But as a side effect, they're going to encounter the ineffable, numinous, nature of reality. And that's going to start to shift this paradigm, one by one.
And everybody, one by one, who's taken the risk of breaking these draconian laws and experimented with psychedelics themselves, vast majority of such people have had these life-transforming experiences also. And it is indeed leading to questioning of the mainstream narrative, which is exactly what we need in the world today. We need this harmful, hateful mainstream narrative to be questioned and in fact, overthrown. It's past its sell-by date. It's doing more harm, much more harm than good. And we need to change everything about the way that things function in our societies today. And we need to, again, psychedelics offer this realization that we're not just meat robots. We're not just here to work and produce and consume. We're here to have the full, in-depth human experience with all that involves. We're here to face the challenges and to answer the questions that our lives confront us with, rather than to be numbed and dulled down by alcohol and TV shows that just encourage more production and consumption. This is a transformative moment in the human story. It'll be interesting to see how it works out. I'm 72 years old now. I'm not sure how much longer I've got to see this happen, but I hope very much to come back in my next life and find the world very, very much changed. One of the mysteries of past lives, or perhaps the interesting point of it, is that when reborn in a new body, part of the deal is that you forget your past life. You may remember it as a child up until the age of 7. Then it gradually drifts away, particularly in societies like ours. And that kind of makes sense to me, because if you knew the rules of the game, if you knew that this was a theatre of experience, that you're here to learn and to grow and to develop, then you might not play the game straight. But if you're not clear on what exactly is going on, you are going to play the game straight, and you're going to have to deal with the choices you make and learn from them. I think physical life in a physical human body is an incredible privilege that the universe has given us. And it's tragic to see how our society conspires, and I'll use that word quite deliberately, conspires to diminish that privilege and to limit our potential rather than to open it up.
Amen. And it's also imagining like how difficult it is to hold on to a dream when you wake up. You can wake up in the morning and be like, I had this unbelievable dream, and then by noon, you're like, what the hell was I dreaming about? Because the world is such a compelling and vibrant and alive dream that we're living in anyways. To hold on to a dream within the dream is very difficult. Very,
very difficult indeed. This is where you're reminding me of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and the way that the short, fast journey that smoked vaped DMT produces, which is typically about 12 minutes, is so overwhelming that it's very hard. You know that something major has happened. There's often a sense of a massive download of information, but it's hard to remember the precise details. Little glimpses come through, but much more was happening at that, and this is why I've talked quite a bit recently about this new project that's taking place at Imperial College in London, led by Dr. Chris Timmerman, where they are giving DMT to human volunteers with a new technology. See, DMT is not normally orally accessible. It becomes orally accessible in the ayahuasca brew because the second element of the ayahuasca brew contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor that switches off an enzyme in our gut that normally stops us absorbing DMT orally. So the best way to experience DMT is to smoke it or to vape it. Then it gets past the blood-brain barrier straight into the brain, or to put it into the bloodstream. And that's what they're doing at Imperial College, and they've developed a new technology that allows the DMT to be administered effectively by drip, and to keep the volunteers in the peak DMT state for an hour plus. I've talked to quite a number of these volunteers. I must say I would find the prospect of being an hour in the peak DMT state pretty alarming, but it gives you the chance to get to grips with, I can only call it a realm, that other realm that you find yourself in. It gives you better hope of remembering it, and quite often the team who are running this study will sit by a volunteer and ask that volunteer what they're seeing, what they're experiencing as it goes through. They'll even put them in MRI scanners to see what's happening in the brain. Again, this is something I find hard to imagine, is speaking on DMT and being in an incredibly noisy, claustrophobic MRI scanner. I mean, that would take some courage to deal with that. Nevertheless, I have actually tried to volunteer for the study at Imperial College, but unfortunately I suffered from grand mal epilepsy. It came on suddenly when I was 67 years old, and they ask a whole series of questions, and one of the things that automatically rules you out is epilepsy. Not because they fear that there's any likelihood that epilepsy will be triggered by DMT, quite the contrary. They just don't want to run that risk of getting their project closed down because somebody has an epileptic fit during this experience. So unfortunately, I won't be able to volunteer for that. But I think it's a highly worthy study, and the purpose of the study is not primarily to look at the therapeutic potential of DMT. It's to look at the potential of DMT for exploring other levels of reality.
It's almost like spiritual cartography.
It's like spiritual, exactly, beautiful phrase. It's like spiritual cartography, to go and map that realm, and to come, and these volunteers are coming back with astonishingly similar experiences, and particularly of accounts with entities who offer them teachings. And for the mainstream just to dismiss all this as nonsense is very, very stupid. And most scientists who do dismiss the DMT experience as nonsense have never had a DMT experience themselves. I don't think anybody's qualified to put down these experiences unless they've had those experiences themselves, in which case they would not be putting them down.
Yeah, it would be like somebody commenting on an orgasm if they've never had one.
Yes, exactly. It's like getting...
What do you really know?
It's like getting advice on the best positions for sex from a celibate priest.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for your theory. No, I have a bit of experience here in this.
Exactly. Experience is the fundamental thing, and I think that's partly what the mainstream is afraid of with psychedelics, is that it is cutting out the intermediary. We don't need the priest or the rabbi or the mullah to tell us what to think. We have the experience directly, and we can make of it what we wish.
Yeah, and it's not just the scientific, empire-driven, and I say empire in the kind of corporatocracy that's just looking to maximize profit above everything else, is really this kind of force that is very oppressive in that regard, and it's woven in with the political. But there's also empire weaves its way through religious structures as well, and this is what you were kind of referring to. It's the same idea. Basically, they're another type of corporation. It's just what they're selling is access. They're selling access to the divine.
Absolutely.
At least that's what they're pretending to sell.
They're all about control. And you mentioned Gnosticism earlier, that psychedelics give us a kind of Gnostic experience, and that's true, because Gnosticism was fundamentally about direct revealed experience, rather than about teachings. And there's no doubt that the early Gnostics and many other ancient societies were using psychedelics extensively in order to mediate these experiences. And of course, that's why Gnosticism, the Gnostic branch of Christianity, was the first bit of Christianity to be persecuted when the Roman Catholic Church came to power under the reign of Constantine and pulled on the jackboots of the Roman Empire. The very first people they started to burn at the stake were the Gnostics. It's not often realized how diverse Christianity was in its early days and how there were many different factions within Christianity, and the Roman Catholic Church was just one of those factions. But it gained political power, and since then has been very reluctant to lose it. And I'm sure there are many wonderful Catholics, but the record of the Catholic Church over the last 1,500 years or so has been a record of cruelty, of suppression, of burning of all the documents in Mexico, for example, of the Maya, keeping their codices, the Mayan codices, up into huge bonfires, thousands of them, and burning them to nothing. So no wonder we're a species with amnesia when these power groups in our society have systematically set about rubbing out the memories of other cultures.
Yeah, it's kind of weaving in two threads, one of the threads of religion and also the other thread about entities. I read your fictional book, War God, and really enjoyed it, and I definitely wanted to bring it up, and this sounds like a good segue for this, because the thesis, so I've had, several hundred DMT experiences from a variety of different ways. Ayahuasca, 30 sometimes, and then a snuff called Vilca, which comes from a seed that contains, NN-DMT, 5-MeO, bufotenine. Yep. I've experienced it, smoked from, mimosa extracts. I've experienced, and then I've been, trained in how to facilitate 5-MeO. DMT, I don't do it, but I went through the whole initiation to kind of learn the ins and outs of it. So very, very familiar with the space, and obviously with that much experience, innumerable encounters with entities, which are far, far more clever than my imagination. So if it is some deeper, inner, recessed archetype of me, then me must be, like the Kybalion says, all is mind, the universe is mental. I must be participating in the all inside me. So actually, the idea of whether the entities are coming from me or out there doesn't really matter to me, because the depth of wisdom that's coming through is far beyond what my conscious, rational mind could ever conjure. So whether it's outside or inside, it's beyond my grasp. It's beyond the pale of what my rational mind could ever do, in so much of a way that it just stays consistently both make me laugh, draw insights, point out things that I couldn't possibly understand. So I'm very, very much familiar with this concept of entities, and the thesis of War God is basically saying that, and I'll let you comment on this, of course, it's your book, but basically saying that the conquistadors, led by Cortez, and actually the Aztecs, who were led by Moctezuma, were both engaging in human sacrifice, in worship of the same demon entity, going under different names. And I thought that premise was like, man, that's fucking... That not only is, it's of course fiction, right? But
yeah, it's fiction, although it's based on quite detailed research about the Spanish conquest of Mexico. That's you've nailed it. That's exactly what I'm talking about. That the entity that appears to Cortez as Saint Peter, and the entity that appears to Moctezuma as Hummingbird, the war god, is actually the same entity in different disguises. And that the purpose of that entity is to maximize human misery. And my God, if there was ever an enterprise that maximized human misery, it was the Spanish conquest of Mexico, bringing in its wake the horrendous curse of smallpox and leading to the annihilation of millions of people across the Americas. I can't help seeing this as a kind of demonic intervention in human affairs. That's what demons are in the business of doing. They're in the business of maximizing misery and maximizing suffering. And the Spanish conquest of Mexico was a huge instrument of misery and suffering, which affected, of course, not only Mexico, but went on to destroy the great civilizations of the high Andes in Peru and in Bolivia, and then went on to destroy the civilizations that we now know existed in the Amazon. Not that they went into the Amazon with swords and spears and guns, but the diseases that they brought spread into the Amazon. And it's now known from very intriguing LiDAR studies, which have been followed up with boots on the ground investigation, that there were huge cities in the Amazon in prehistory, and they existed up until the time that the Spaniards appeared bringing these diseases with them. And then those diseases just spread like wildfire across South America and wiped out these populations, which became empty and deserted within 100 years. And we're just now finding their remains. LiDAR is a non-destructive way of investigating what's under the Amazon rainforest canopy, and it is revealing not only the evidence of enormous populations, but also the evidence of highly sophisticated geometrical structures. And all of this was brought to a sudden, horrific end as a result of the conquest. What a pity. What I felt when I have to say, by the way, nobody reads my novels. I'm only known for my non-fiction books, and I've still got a fourth volume of War God to write, because there's been so many developments in the lost civilization field that have brought my energies for the past few years. But what I wanted to do in that series was to get inside the heads of the main players and understand what drove them and what motivated them. And that's one of the things that fiction allows a writer to do, which is difficult to do in non-fiction. Yeah. And I found that by being able to put myself into the heads of my characters, I began to understand what happened during the Spanish conquest of Mexico much better than I did before. And if I may add on that, the impetus to begin writing some fiction came from an ayahuasca experience. It was, in fact, 5 ayahuasca experiences. I've had about 70 plus journeys with ayahuasca over the years, starting in 2003. But in 2007 in Brazil, a series of 5 sessions over 2 weeks were entirely focused on giving me the plot of a novel. And that novel I wrote before I wrote War God, and that novel is called Entangled. And again, it posits a demonic force that is trying to maximize misery and that travels through time. So there is a young woman in the 21st century and a young woman 24,000 years ago who are literally entangled, and they have to cooperate together to fight this demonic force and not allow it to succeed. I got all of that. I didn't even know I could write a novel. I got it all in a series of images and instructions during these ayahuasca sessions, and at the very end of it, I was told very firmly, go away and write it. So I set down my non-fiction writing, and I went away and wrote it, and then I carried on and began to write the War God series. So what that says to me, amongst many things, is that these psychedelic experiences can also be enormously creative. That they unlock creative sides of ourselves that we might not even have known existed before.
Absolutely.
And that idea of the demonic force, of course, is also central to Gnosticism, where that force is referred to as the archons, whose whole project is to make the human race as miserable and fail to reach our potential as possible. And no wonder that the Gnostics were very familiar with altered states of consciousness.
Yeah, I encountered an entity in an ayahuasca session with, I worked with the Quechua healer, Maestro Orlando Chulindama, and so I encountered I've encountered many dark entities, of course, and many light entities and beautiful
That's
entities.
true, Aubrey. We do it. It's not all sweetness and light in ayahuasca.
Oh no, yeah. If you're going for Candyland, you picked the wrong cup.
You have to brace yourself every time. I do anyway.
Of course. And I encountered this being that was technological in nature. It was absolutely demonic, and I was like, what up? Like, what are you? You know, I had other guidance and I had other, like, what are you? And I was like, this is the they called it the Mecha Archon, which was like the technological. It was like the Archon that was working through technology to actually like undermine our own faculties of thought and our own consciousness, and we can kind of see this, and obviously everybody's kind of aware of the dangers of the cell phones and the social media and our addiction to technology in all of these different ways, but it actually appeared to me embodied as an entity, and it was quite interesting, and it's allowed me to start thinking about any aggregation, archetypal aggregation of energy, you can actually, and I alluded to this earlier, you could, if you wanted, to deify that and make it a demon or an angel or something like that. And it may or may not be what we call, quote, real, but the energy is real that's behind it.
Yeah.
And that's like, it starts to like allow you to think about these things, not as like fairy tale superstitions, but just like, this is the aggregation of archetypal energy and does that actually, when it's aggregated in that particular form, does it have consciousness itself and also choice? And that's where it gets very, very interesting. And to me, the answer is yes, based on the experiences that I've had.
Me too.
But either way, it's quite interesting. And then what I've also realized is we can look at even ancient Greek and ancient Roman, pantheon, the Olympians, of course, and say, great stories. But I've had encounters with those beings. It's totally shocking. Totally shocking. Like, who is this? Mercury. And where did I feel it? I felt this hot energy moving through my ankles. And I was like, oh, they always put wings on the ankles. And I'm just like, Mercury? And then it's like, yeah. I was like, whoa, Mercury. I didn't think that was a real being. I thought that was just like a story.
Yeah. No, not a story, an experience. This is it's fascinating when you look at the ancient Egyptian pantheon, and indeed many others around the world before we got into this top-down controlling system of the monotheistic faiths, which have sought to attribute everything sacred to one entity. When we look at these older spiritual and religious systems, as in the case of ancient Egypt, you'll find that almost every single one of the ancient Egyptian deities has what's rightly referred to as a therianthropic appearance from the Greek therion, which means wild beast, and anthropos, which means man. But there's a combination of animal and human characteristics. Think of the god Horus with his hawk head. Think of Thoth with the head of an ibis. Think of Anubis with the head of a jackal. These are not things that one sees in normal, alert, everyday problem-solving state of consciousness. But they are things that we routinely see in deeply altered states of consciousness. And many of the entities that I've encountered in ayahuasca visions, and indeed in smoked DMT visions as well, have had this therianthropic quality. What's interesting with the DMT in pure form is precisely what you mentioned, although you got it from an ayahuasca experience, which is DMT, mediated through that, is the technological element of the entities that are often encountered. That's rarer in ayahuasca experiences, but it does happen. The ayahuasca experiences, it's interesting that there are these differences. And in the Amazon, they say that the difference is precisely caused by the ayahuasca vine. That the ayahuasca vine, which itself is not consciousness altering, or not particularly so, is the master plant, and that it's harnessing the leaves that contain the DMT to give us this experience. So it's interesting that when mediated with the ayahuasca vine, the realm that one enters is often very jungly and full of serpents and full of jaguars and panthers. A very jungly, organic realm. Whereas quite often with smoked DMT, it's a very mechanical world. The entities seem like machines, and powerful machines by all means, but machines still have this trickster quality about them. But there have been times on my ayahuasca journeys where it's flipped over into a very technological DMT type of dream, and I just don't know what these things are or what is going on. I don't think anybody does, but I think it merits much further investigation, and that's why I celebrate what's happening at Imperial College in London now, because these experiences, I think, have been fundamental to human culture over tens of thousands of years, and for our society, which is really just the sort of fingertip on the end of the long arm of human culture, for our society to write off all those experiences and to demonize them and punish them is a terrible mistake.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I really celebrated about War God as well is I think you can get into this mindset that all primitive cultures or all non-Western cultures were better in every way, and that psychedelics are always always helpful. They're a panacea. They're always good. But you tell the story very clearly, and inside the minds and the hearts
Yo, Mike
and
Tyson, what's
thoughts
up, man?
of the priests of Moctezuma, who were taking psychedelic mushrooms. They call it teotihuacán or something like that. And
Mike Tyson, I'm doing well. How are
taking
you?
psychedelic mushrooms and cutting the hearts out of people by the thousands.
Committing
Mike
horrific
Tyson.
murders on a gigantic
Legend.
scale in honor of this demonic entity that they regarded as somehow worthy of worshiping, and that's why I also present the balance to that in the book, because a lot of Christians will condemn those cultures for carrying out human sacrifice, forgetting
Thanks, Mike.
that Christianity itself carried
I
out
appreciate
human
that. That's
sacrifice
nice of you.
repeatedly over hundreds and hundreds of years. The last witch burnings took place in England in the 18th century. That's just really not
It's
very
very
long
kind
ago.
of you. Thanks,
Burn
man.
somebody at the stake in the name of your deity, and what you're performing is an act of human sacrifice, which is
You're
no different
welcome.
from the acts of human sacrifice that were carried out by the Aztecs. It's the same end result. In fact, if I were given the choice as to which way I'd rather go, I'd rather have a foot
Streaming on
knife thrust to the
Twitch,
heart and slowly burned at the stake like Giordano Bruno, hung upside down. And
I've been
allowed
streaming
to
a few
suffer for
years
24 hours
now.
before he died. This is the cruelty and wickedness of the Christian church over the years. We all often hear so many great things about the Christian church, and that's fine, but to be real, we have to accept the fact that this religion has been the source of so much division and so much cruelty in the world over so long that we really need to ask ourselves, what is that thing that we're calling God?
Yeah, a few years now.
And the Gnostics were very clear that entity called Yahweh or Jehovah was not a god at all. He was an imposter. He was a demon. And his purpose was to mislead the human race.
Yeah, I
That was his
have.
purpose,
Thanks,
and he
dude.
certainly succeeded in doing so.
It took me a long time. It took me a year and a half.
You know that you're upside down, right?
Yeah.
Like God is.
Took me a year and a half of
experience
streaming.
It can be overwhelming in all of the consciousness of life. It contains all the light.
You
and
need
all
like
the dark,
50
but it is not
followers,
something you
and
fear. It's the
you need an average
overflowing
of
eminence of love.
3
Emanation of
viewers,
love that's going
I think,
everywhere.
for
It's the
8 hours
opposite,
a month.
It's like you want more, not less.
Oh, that's
of
nice.
this being. And
Thank
so
you.
it just
Appreciate
points
it.
to
Thank
the
you. Appreciate
upside
being
down
here. That's
nature
nice words.
that we've been in. We're not only a culture of amnesia, but we're a culture that's been like Giordano Bruno, who was actually hung upside down when he should have been turned right side up and put on a pedestal and said thank you to it. He was upside down, just like the whole structure of everything was upside down. And I can only imagine, from my understandings of Yeshua and the deep mystical power of his teachings, that what has been done in the name of Yeshua, in the name of Jesus, is the absolute upside downing of everything that he stood for.
If you're a well-known
I completely
streamer.
agree with you. And again, the Gnostics
I don't
saw
know, man.
the figure of Jesus as a
For
Gnostic
sure,
teacher.
I guess.
They didn't see him as
I'm
a
just
divine.
streaming away.
They
I'm
saw him
living
as
my
a teacher,
life.
who
I'm
As
living
divine as
my
all of us,
life
which is what
on
Jesus was trying to
camera.
say all along.
Yes,
That's how I'm doing it.
That's right.
That's how I'm feeling
we're
it.
all
I'm living my life on camera.
sons of
Alright,
God.
I'll be right back though. I gotta.
God. But
Time sensitive. I appreciate you being here, Mike. I'll be back. Be right back.
What we're dealing with in the big monotheistic faiths is, I go with the Gnostic view. It's an imposter. It's an entity that seeks to mislead humanity, and that can be shown from the works of these religions and the harm and the damage that they've caused. And I know that what I'm saying is going to be outrageous to large numbers of people, but just think about it. Just think about stoning a woman to death because she's unfaithful to her husband, which still happens today in Islamic cultures. Just think about the cruelty of the Christian church and the burning at the stake of its opponents over centuries and centuries, and ask yourself, can this really be excused? Can the religion be excused for that? Many people say, well, that happened then, but it's not true Christianity. Well, I'm afraid it is true Christianity, and if that religion cannot deal with its own baggage, then it's not going to go very much further.
And I think the safeguards on all of these structures are actually, in many ways, these psychedelic experiences, the experiences of transcendence, where you get to actually encounter both imposters and the truth, and then you actually get to sort out from the inside, from what we feel, anthro-ontologically, like what's happening in our body, like through my body I vision God. This feeling of understanding what's actually happening, then it allows you to set the world through your own gnosis. It allows you to become your own Gnostic, and that's the safeguard for all of these atrocities that has been categorically removed.
And what I'd like to say to anybody who's not worked with these plant medicines, it's fungi medicines as well, is that they are teachers. They are teachers. Fundamentally, it's a very strange thing that plants, which we regard as non-sentient, nevertheless, the mixture of the two plants involved in the ayahuasca brew immediately puts us face to face with our own baggage and starts teaching us how to deal with that. Of course, we can't put right mistakes we've made in the past, but we don't have to keep on making those mistakes in the future. And the real work begins after the session. I'm sure you'll agree. It doesn't begin. It's not a session. It's not a magic pill, which is suddenly going to transform your life. It's a medicine that's going to teach you stuff about yourself and give you the opportunity to change. But integrating those lessons that you've learned into the life that you live on this plane, that's where the hard work really begins. Far from being a magic pill, it's a recipe for years of hard work and working on oneself to be a better and more nurturing and more positive and more useful person, and not to harm others.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. And this was, again, to sort of weave back to the partially told story from Matthias de Stefano, which I'm sure
let's go back to that.
Everybody people might want to hear, and also to understand that those cultures had no such restrictions on psychedelic medicine. But as Matthias tells the story, in their understanding, at least in what was told to him, and again, the story of Atlantis and the Atlantean civilization was passed down through many generations by the time he got it. So he doesn't remember a life in Atlantis. Just one of the post-Atlantean civilizations.
Right.
And the story that was told was both, yes, the meteors that came down and they hit in a variety of different places. They melted the ice. There was floods, but there was a causality that they attributed to it, in that the Atlanteans had put up in all throughout their empire, they'd made structures where priests could enter into consciousness, and the structures were resonant with the stars, and they actually developed somewhat of a spiritual worldwide web of consciousness. So, like what Rupert Sheldrake would call the morphic resonance field. They were actually able to tap into that in a really profound way, and they were holding a balance of the earth. But actually, this idea of empire, or this kind of demonic idea of control over other people, there was a faction that kind of split off that said, no, we don't want this centralized Atlantean kind of control of our consciousness. And there was a conflict, and the Atlanteans tried to make a power move where they tried to actually use these technologies, which were meant to hold balance and equanimity for the earth, for power, and it disrupted the grid in a fundamental way. And the disruption of the grid actually removed the protection that the earth had, because it's not every 12,500 years or whatever that the meteors hit. It's just every once in a while. And so, in their understanding, they were holding a protection over the earth that left because everything was in chaos, because the desire for power had gotten into the Atlanteans, who lived peacefully for 4,000 years or so before that. And when that happened, that's when all the cataclysm began. So there's a cautionary tale that he remembers of, this is what happens when you go try to make that move for power. It like throws everything out of balance. And very much so, we're in the same. It's also another warning for us, because we're in the same moment.
Yeah, well, we're the next lost civilization. That's what our civilization is today. We don't have to be, but choices need to be made. We have to change the path that all the big industrialized technological countries are on right now. Otherwise, there's not even going to take a cosmic disaster. We're going to bring ourselves down, collapse and destroy our civilization. Lose all the support systems that we've relied upon, and be put in a place where we have to rely only on ourselves again. And that would be very difficult. That's why I think our civilization today is fragile, because it looks strong. It's capable of incredible technological feats, but psychically, it's very fragile. and not ready to confront the chaos that may come.
No doubt, no doubt. And these stories from the past are important. And I think this is the point you make. It's a point that Matthias makes as well. Like, these stories of the past are important. And to not only show us, the classic, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. This is, so he actually had that woven into the story. So it was not only a particular time, but it was a particular
In what
mindset.
state of consciousness is he when he has these past life experiences?
Full on, he has full access. So he has a phone with a stylus, and he takes notes to himself in Atlantean like cuniform, basically.
Right. So he's entering a trance-like state autonomously, without the need of.
It's just that he calls himself. He's like, I'm a particular type of being. It's like a memory cell, and whatever function that wipes out the memory and makes it like a dream for most people, I'm the one that was supposed to. I'm just built that I'm supposed to remember. And so he doesn't consider himself special or like it's a special gift. It's just like, I'm a memory cell in this collective, like one organ, like the call it the pituitary or whatever of all humanity. He's that one cell in that particular gland that's able to remember. And he's, he sings on my podcast. He's sung some songs that he would sing to his daughter. And he was a woman in that life, and this life he's a gay man, and he's loving his life in this life, and he loved his life then, and he's singing songs to his daughter in this lullaby, and he sung that song, and there was something so human that woke up in me, some like ancestral memory when I heard this Atlantean lullaby. And he's not a great singer, he's not trying to be a performing artist, but it was just sung like a mother would sing to their daughter. And it was so powerful. Like, of all the things, of course I approach all of these things skeptically. I don't actually even believe in astrology and numerology. I'm open to it, but I've never found anything compelling. I'm not like super into all of these phenomenons, but when I hear his song, and my body knows it as a real song and knows it as, I know it is true. It's just this interesting thing. And of course, all of his wisdom matches up.
What level?
Exactly, resonates at the heart level. Like, I feel it, and everything that he's saying, correlates with everything that you're writing. So the scientific evidence of the past, and then also what he's talking about the cosmos correlates with my 23 years of psychedelic adventuring, where I've just, all of the entities and the dimensionality and all these experiences. There's so much correlation that I haven't found any dissonance between that which I know internally and that which I learn from individuals like yourself about the past. So it's been really like a beautiful relationship to have, and he's just a great human being. And he can enter trance states as well, and then channel other different types of energies, but he has waking access to that memory.
What's often forgotten is that DMT is a natural brain hormone.
Right.
It's present in all human beings, in fact in almost all animal life, but usually in sub-psychedelic quantities. Some people may have a bit more of it than others, and it may just open those doorways that are normally closed for most of us without help of psychedelics. It's an interesting phenomenon, actually, that a natural brain hormone is illegal, but that's the world we live in today. What he was saying also, really strongly supported by Plato, who's the earliest surviving tradition of Atlantis, is passed down to us by Plato, who makes it clear that his ancestor Solon learned the story in ancient Egypt, and indeed speaks of how Atlantis was once a beautiful civilization, but that how it became cruel, and how it began to impose will upon others, to use its technology to gain power. That it ceased to wear its prosperity with moderation, and in response to that, the universe finally had enough and struck it down. I think the balance between human beings and the universe is something else that's ignored in our civilization today. We are part of the universe, and our behavior and even our thoughts have universal implications that we are taught to ignore at our peril.
I couldn't agree more. So well said. And And so to continue on with some of the things that you might find interesting, and I deeply hope that you guys are able to have a conversation at some point. I think it would be a beautiful experience for you guys to talk. But he shares that he was actually part of the Water Guild, as I said, that was cutting the stones. But the Air Guild and the Earth Guild would actually, they would go into a trance, and they would get into like psychic resonance with the stones, and they would be singing. And as they would be singing, and singing was pretty much part of all of the different guilds. They would use sound and sound healing, and sound medicine technology, sound technology, through their own voice. And they would get into resonance with the stones, and they would actually then start to raise the octaves of how they were singing. And so they would actually raise the weight as they raised so they would make the stones lighter by how they would sing and how they would actually move the density of the stones through the octaves, which they would be elevating. And this was part of the technology that answers the question, well, how the hell did they get all these stones up in the first place? How did they move them all? Well, they had people who were part of this, the Air Guild, who could sing into the stone and then move it however they wanted, and the Water Guild would cut the stones.
Right. Again, it makes perfect sense to me. There are a number of ancient Egyptian traditions that speak of these massive stones being lifted by priests chanting. And it's not an accident that singing is also a hugely important part of the ayahuasca journey, particularly in the Amazon. The Icaros that the shamans sing there guide the journey. They're like a road through that realm.
So as you hear something like that, and also I'll just finish with the last bit of the story that I think you might find interesting. There's tales in many of the different mythologies of them being giants, these members of these other civilizations. He said, well, yes, we had these spiritual technologies, and our consciousness was giant. They've been using psychedelic plant medicines, and they've been evolving, but they also had different levels of nutrition. They had different levels of medicine, and just like you see in a lot of cultures who've had different access to protein and different access to, they were just large. They were actually larger, and they lived a lot longer. Their lifespan was 80 to 100 years, just like ours, and they were healthy and strong and robust, and they had this kind of spiritual prowess. So they were giants in a way. They lived several times as long, and they were, it was just the advancements of the culture in that
intellectual
way.
Certainly.
Yeah, for sure, and slightly physically larger. And then, and as they went around, to these different, as they re-civilized, kind of repopulated and dispersed around the world. Eventually, like the question is, all right, what happened to them? Well, they just started, they started breeding and kind of interbreeding with all the local populations until eventually.
Populations,
That's it, and that's really how it went. They didn't decide to just, we're only gonna, sleep with each other like the Targaryens or something from Game of Thrones. It's like they just dispersed and they made love to all of the people of the different lands, and the DNA was.
And they brought with them knowledge, and that knowledge filtered down, and we can see evidence of it still extant in the world today, and massively denied by mainstream science. But there is a heritage that the whole human race has received, I believe, from a lost civilization of prehistory. And I think Atlantis is a really good name for that lost civilization, because fundamentally it does come to us from Plato, the earliest surviving account of it. And I've seen academics twist themselves into knots trying to dismiss Plato's account. They can respect him in all other ways. But the moment he starts talking about a lost civilization, he can't possibly be talking about something real. Right. Even though he repeats many times that this is a true story based on facts, that's ignored, and they say he's trying to set up some kind of political model or make some sort of philosophical point. Anything rather than admit that he's reporting true history.
Yeah, indeed. So when you hear you've been to more of these sacred sites than I ever have, but I've been to some of the ones down in Peru, and it's unbelievably stunning, the stonework that's there. So when you hear this account, from Matthias, of the way that they actually changed the weight of the stones, they still had to move them. They couldn't just like totally levitate them telekinesis with their mind. They still had to move them, but they could change the weight of them so that they were much easier to move by singing into resonance with them, and they could cut them with water instead of actually having to use chisels and things. Does this make sense from what you've seen on the ground and what you've been able to put your hand on these stones and see all over the world?
It makes perfect sense to me. And of course, in saying that, I know that I'm handing a hostage to fortune and giving my critics a stick to beat me with. Because of course, to speak of anything like telekinesis or telepathic powers is regarded by the Academy today as complete nonsense. And it's often used, actually. In my books, I probably don't devote more than a page across thousands of pages to that speculation. That their technology was very different from ours, that it was based on latent faculties of the human mind that have fallen into, that have relapsed in our civilization today, but that were highly prominent in the past, and that the human mind is capable of far more than we give it credit for. It doesn't have to be mediated through machines or leverage in the way that it is in our society. The human mind can have a direct impact on physical reality. And you mentioned Rupert Sheldrake earlier, a man for whom I have the deepest respect. Rupert is a real scientist, but he's a rebel. He's stood out against the Academy. He stood out and presented solid scientific evidence, for example, for telepathy, which is very difficult to refute. And how do they refute it? They just ignore him and sneer at him and pour scorn upon him. So I'm very proud of Rupert that he's just kept on presenting the evidence, sticking with the facts, and pushing it in their faces to the point where it becomes ridiculous to resist it. We've all had experiences of telepathy, and it isn't absurd to suggest that ability could be magnified with training and with focusing on it. But it's difficult for it to be magnified in a society that despises such ideas, which is our society today.
It's difficult for several reasons, according to Matthias. As I've asked Matthias, like, well, could we do this now with the proper training? And what he's saying is very much, in accord with the ideas that Rupert kind of proposes of this morphic resonance field. But he talks about this field of belief, that there's actually a field of belief that's necessary to actually hold the possibility of somebody able to do this. Now, of course, the critics and skeptics will say, oh, of course, that's a convenient excuse. But fundamentally, the interconnectivity between belief and consciousness and reality, in the way that even in the quantum realms now, that like I think it was Hoffman who's talking about like local realism is being challenged. The idea that actually our observation of something is actually necessary for that thing to actually be what it actually is, and this is it builds upon the observer effect in quantum mechanics. And of course, is beyond my pay grade.
It's one of the exciting ways where there's a nexus with psychedelic experiences of other realms and quantum physics, recognizing the probability of parallel realms, parallel universes. What quantum physics hasn't explored yet, it hasn't got into yet, is how do we explore and map those realms, and maybe psychedelics are the answer.
Spiritual cartography, I'm into it. But so ultimately what he's saying is that the field of belief, the collective beliefs, all of the observations that believe that this is possible or not, that has to be softened in order to, and allow for the possibility for this to emerge. And I actually think that this is going to return in our future as more and more people become open to these ideas. I think we're actually, in our lifetimes, going to see the return of what we would now call magic. But what they just did back then is this was a part of the laws of their reality that they lived in, and we would call it magic now, but it will become just part of the natural order of things.
Or
and
we
I
could say
that'll come in our lifetimes.
Magic is just science we don't understand.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, well said. Well said.
And it's another one of those words that are sneered at by the Academy. Any notion of magic is dismissed, but that's also dismissing human potential in all sorts of ways. So Matthias sounds like he's had some very important and very valuable experiences. I shall definitely learn more about.
Yeah, happy to connect you guys, or maybe if you do make it down here to Austin, we could all get on a podcast together, and I can just sit back and smile as you guys tell stories about the ancient past.
Yeah, obviously I'm coming to it from a different point of view. I don't personally have strong past life experiences. I have since my childhood, I've had an absolute horror of being burnt at the stake. Something I get very emotional about. I do speculate sometimes, was I burnt at the stake in a past life? Is that where this comes from? The way now that the Academy is trying to burn me at the stake for my Ancient Apocalypse series and for my books, pouring scorn upon me, presenting me as an enemy of society. The Guardian newspaper says it's the most dangerous show on television. This is the modern way to burn somebody at the stake. Is to destroy them with attacks on their person, which when you investigate them turn out to have no basis. But the attack itself is enough to smear that individual in the eyes of so many who trust those media. You asked me earlier how I would react to definite proof that my hypothesis, my working hypothesis, which is always changing by the way, is wrong. And my answer to that is I have changed my views extensively as I've gone along. My policy with books is I'll never change a single word of a book once I've published it. I don't want to whitewash the book. I want it to be there on the record. I've updated a couple of books, but only in the way of adding a forward and an afterword. I leave the original text present. There are things in Fingerprints of the Gods that I don't go with anymore. That was the first book I published on the possibility of a lost civilization. And what I've done is I've written further books where I've explored those avenues that I didn't explore properly in Fingerprints of the Gods, and Magicians of the Gods and America Before are the most recent examples of that, so that anybody who wants to critique my work can have a full view of everything that I've done since the 1990s, and I won't go back and edit anything. As I say, I'll only add an afterword or a forward to it. But what puzzles me, or doesn't really puzzle me actually, because that's the world we live in, is that in most of the attacks that have been made on my work, the archaeologists and their friends in the media who are attacking me talk only about Fingerprints of the Gods, which I published 27 years ago, and don't talk a word about Magicians of the Gods or America Before, because they know they're on more difficult ground there. I've been improving my game, continuously improving. I learn from my mistakes, and I incorporate that learning into new work. But at the same time, I don't want to pretend that that I didn't say something in the past. I did say it, and it's there, and I'll keep it on record forever, and let people make up their own minds.
And we're in a fortunate time as well with all of these difficulties and challenges. We're in the fortunate time that you get to reach people without those filters of the kind of guardians of the guardian, an interesting word, but the guardians of the mainstream narrative. Because you've been able to go on Joe Rogan's podcast, and you're on my podcast now, and obviously it's not the size of Rogan's, but we're reaching hundreds of thousands, millions of people.
We're reaching very large numbers of people, and this is one of the great developments in the world we live in today. We've talked a lot about the negative things, but the ability for people to speak freely and communicate with other like-minded people has dramatically increased as a result of podcasts like yours and Joe's podcast. Joe's podcast it's the first time I've appeared on your podcast, but Joe Rogan's podcast has been enormously important to me. At the first episode I did with him was back in 2011. I think it was episode 147.
Yeah, I remember that.
And he suddenly put my work in front of a whole new audience who weren't aware of it at all, and that has definitely empowered me. And so I'm grateful to the podcast realm for allowing me freedom of speech. And allowing me to get what I have to say across in a way that the mainstream media just will never do. The only story that the mainstream media want to write about me is that Hancock is a crackpot, he's dangerous, and he's misleading the public. That's the only story they want to tell. I've had a recent example, I won't name of a newspaper in Britain, who clearly wanted to go on that bandwagon as well, to gallop with the herd of pouring scorn upon me. But I insisted that we do a written interview. And I gave them detailed written replies to all of their questions. And at the end of the day, because those written replies would not have allowed them to do the hatchet job they wanted to do, they just didn't publish the story.
Yeah, well, we this is the time we're in, and there's a cautionary tale and a meta cautionary tale in the story that you've told, and I just want to say personally, for me, just the deepest gratitude and thanks for your courage and for standing out, both for what you've shared again about the evidence of ancient civilization, but also the way that you've stood on the meta perspective, the way that you've stood and withstood these attacks, and been an example of someone with dignity and integrity and courage. And you know, this is a model that's invaluable, even beyond the work that you've put out there, which is also invaluable. But so just the utmost admiration and gratitude for you as a human, and your incredible body of work.
Thank you, Aubrey. One of the things that gives me hope is the way that young people and even young trainee archaeologists respond to my work. And I often get private communications from people who say that my work has caused them to think again about everything. And if I'm doing that even with a small number of people, then I'm grateful for the opportunity to do that.
I think you have no idea about the positive impact you've had on the world and will continue to have on the world. It's probably even more enormous than your mind can even grapple with.
Sweet of you to say that. Thank you.
I believe it wholeheartedly, and hopefully as our journeys wend along their way, I would love to have another conversation with you, and there's many more things to explore.
Absolutely. I'll look forward to the next time, Aubrey.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Thank you, Graham, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into this video. Make sure you hit subscribe, follow me at Aubrey Marcus, check out the Aubrey Marcus podcast, available everywhere, and leave a comment. Let me know if this video resonated or what else you would like to hear from me in the future. Thank you so much.
sorry. No, I was like an hour ago. I'm sorry. I can't do it. I can't play this game anymore. I'm gonna have to sign off. I can't do it. I was thinking maybe I'd take like a little break. I hung out with my dad, but I can't play this game anymore. I just can't do it tonight. We might switch to Breath of the Wild right now. Let me... Give me a minute.
Yesterday was the anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. How fitting.
I guess it is, but of course he didn't discover it. In fact, the Americas may have been discovered as early as 130,000 years ago, which makes 1492 AD.
Actually, no, I'm gonna sign off, and if I start again,
of course, this is a matter that's disputed by archaeologists. Nevertheless, there's a highly professional team from the San Diego Natural History Museum who've excavated what is called the Cerruti Mastodon site just south of San Diego. And I've been there into the museum and talked to the leading expert, Tom Demaray. And what they found was mastodon bones that had been crushed systematically and in an organized way using some kind of stone tool to extract the marrow. And the only interpretation they're able to put upon this,
I'm going to switch to Zelda.
Human beings. Whether it was
thank you.
other kinds of human species,
I might have to restart stream. Let's see.
Perhaps even Neanderthals, or whether it was anatomically modern humans, all of us were around 130,000 years ago. But it's human behavior that we're looking at, the systematic killing of an animal and then the fracturing of its bones to extract the marrow. Now, of course, this is regarded as some kind of terrible heresy by archaeologists who've been wedded to the idea of a very recent settlement of the Americas for The view is that anatomically modern humans came into Europe about 60,000 years ago, maybe.